Hey there, tonight we're diving into the intricate tapestry of the ancient Norse's religious beliefs. What you're about to discover is the surprising way their gods walked not just in myths, but alongside them in everyday life. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. In the frosty realms of ancient Scandinavia, where the nights were longer than a line at the DMV, the Norse folks had a religion that was as wild and unpredictable as a Viking on a Friday night raid. Now, before you picture Thor as just the dreamy Chris Hemsworth swinging his hammer, let's dive into the Norse pantheon, a collection of gods and goddesses who could give any soap opera cast a run for their money in terms of drama and dysfunction. First up, we have Odin, the All-Father who wasn't just some wise old guy with a penchant for poetry. He's the chief honcho of the gods, often seen with two ravens, Hygiene and Munin, who acted like his personal Twitter feed, keeping him updated on the world. Odin's quest for wisdom was so intense that he sacrificed an eye to drink from the well of Erd. Talk about paying a high price for knowledge. Most of us just Google it. Oh, and he had this little thing about preparing for Ragnarök, the end of the world, which he was convinced would be the ultimate battle. Spoiler alert, he was right, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Then there's Thor, Odin's son, who's basically the Norse god equivalent of a rock star. He's got the long hair, the hammer Mjolnir that could crush mountains, and a temper that could rival a toddler who missed their nap. Thor's adventures often involve him smashing giants and chugging mead by the barrel. He was the protector of humanity, which is a lot of responsibility for a guy who once tried to lift a giant cat disguised as the Midgard serpent. Not exactly a cat person, I presume. Loki, the trickster god, is the kind of guy who'd RSVP to your wedding just to cause chaos. He's the Norse god of mischief, which sounds fun until you realize his antics often end in someone losing a life or a limb. Loki's a shapeshifter, so one minute he's a handsome man, the next he's a mare giving birth to an 8-legged horse. Yes, you heard that right. And yes, it's as weird as it sounds. Loki's relationship with the rest of the gods can best be described as complicated. He's like that friend who's great at parties but can't be trusted with important tasks. And let's not forget Freyja, the goddess of love, beauty, and war. Because why not? She's a multifaceted deity who could charm you with her beauty or terrify you on the battlefield. Freyja had a chariot pulled by cats. Yes, cats, proving once and for all that felines have always had a thing for divas. Now, before we get too cozy with these divine personalities, let's take a stroll through Norse creation myths, which are a blend of the epic and the absurd. In the beginning, there was a yawning void called Ginnungagga. From this void emerged Ymir, the first giant, who wasn't exactly what you'd call a benevolent creator. He spawned other giants from his armpits and legs, because why not? Giants in Norse mythology are often seen as the chaotic forces of nature, and Ymir was their granddaddy. Enter Ordhamla, the cosmic cow. She's not just any cow, she's the cow that nurtures the universe. Ordhamla fed Ymir with her milk, and while she was at it, she uncovered another being from the ice, Berry, who would go on to father the line of gods. Imagine a cow being the reason we're all here, a mutastic twist in the cosmic narrative. The gods, led by Odin, eventually decided that Ymir was more of a problem than a patriarch and took him down. From his corpse they crafted the world. His blood became the seas, his bones the mountains, and his skull the sky. A little morbid, sure, but efficient. The Norse were nothing if not practical, even in their mythology. These myths, filled with cosmic cows and the bloody remains of giants, might sound like something out of a heavy metal album, but they set the stage for the Norse cosmology, a worldview where the universe is constantly on the brink of chaos, and the gods are doing their best to keep it all together. This perspective was crucial for the Vikings, who lived in a harsh environment where survival depended on both strength and cunning. Fast forward to today, and you'll find echoes of these myths in pop culture. From Marvel movies to video games like God of War, the Norse gods have leaped from ancient sagas to modern screens. But while the Hollywood version tends to smooth out the rough edges, The original myths are full of contradictions and complexities that reflect the Norse understanding of life. It wasn't all heroics and hammer-throwing. There was treachery, humor, and a good dose of existential dread. So, as you drift off to dreamland, remember that the Norse pantheon and their creation stories are more than just ancient tales. They're a window into the minds of people who face the unknown with a mix of courage and irreverence. And who knows, maybe somewhere in the cosmos, a giant cow is still making history in her own unique way. Speaking of cosmic cows, let's milk some truth from the everyday religious practices of the Norse, a people who knew how to party with the gods, literally. Forget the notion of Vikings as just axe-swinging marauders. They had rituals that would make a modern festival look like a backyard barbecue. From sacrifices to festivals, the Norse weren't just about surviving. They were about thriving, with a little divine intervention. Let's start with sacrifices, a practice that's been romanticized to the point where you'd think every Viking raid ended with a heartfelt offering to Odin. The reality: sacrifices were as much about community cohesion as they were about appeasing the gods. Animals, and occasionally humans, yes, you heard that right, were offered up in rituals that could be as elaborate as a Broadway production. Archaeologists have uncovered sites like the one at Trelleborg, Denmark, where hundreds of animal bones suggest that not every sacrifice was a solemn affair. Some were more like a Norse version of a block party. You'd have the whole village gathered, probably with barrels of ale, because what's a ritual without refreshments? The economic implications were significant. Sacrificing livestock wasn't cheap. Each animal was a small fortune. A single cow could be worth the equivalent of several months' wages for a Viking farmer. This meant that communities often pooled resources, turning sacrifices into communal investments in their spiritual and social well-being. It was less about the gods demanding tribute and more about reinforcing social bonds and showing off a bit. After all, nothing says, "We're doing well," like a sacrificial banquet that leaves everyone in a mead-induced stupor. But it wasn't all about sacrifices. Festivals played a key role in the Norse religious calendar, with Yule being the showstopper. Imagine a festival so epic it inspired modern Christmas traditions, minus the jolly man in a red suit. Yule was about celebrating the winter solstice, marking the return of longer days, and boy, did the Norse know how to celebrate. Picture feasting, drinking, and games that could easily turn into brawls. It was a time to honor the gods, particularly Thor and Freya, the latter being a deity associated with fertility and prosperity. And let's not forget the Yule boar, a roast so revered it became the centerpiece of the feast, a tradition echoed in today's Christmas hams. Religious leaders, known as Garthar, were the rock stars of these events. They were more than just priests. They were political leaders and community organizers. The Garthar wielded significant power, acting as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Their influence extended beyond the spiritual realm, often playing crucial roles in local governance. In a way, they were the Norse equivalent of those celebrity pastors with a flair for the dramatic. And like any good leader, they knew how to work the crowd, ensuring that the gods got their due and the people got their fill. These practices, while religious in nature, had practical benefits too. They reinforced social hierarchies and ensured economic redistribution. By pooling resources for sacrifices and feasts, the Norse communities strengthened bonds and maintained social order. It wasn't just about divine favor. It was about survival in a world where winter could be as unforgiving as a Norse saga. However, let's not fall into the trap of romanticizing this as some idyllic spiritual existence. The reality was far more complex, and at times, brutal. The famous Blart rituals, for instance, often involved blood sacrifices, and while they were meant to curry favor with the gods, they also served as a stark reminder of the harsh realities of life. The Norse were pragmatic. They knew that in a world where nature was capricious, every little bit of divine help counted. Religion was woven into the fabric of Norse society, influencing everything from legal decisions to warfare. A Viking wouldn't just set sail without consulting the gods, often seeking omens or the blessing of a seer. These practices highlight a society deeply connected to its spiritual beliefs, but also one that used religion as a means of navigating the unpredictable world they lived in. So, as we continue to explore the Norse world, let's keep in mind that their religious practices were more than just quaint traditions. They were vital components of a complex societal structure. serving both spiritual and practical needs. The Vikings may have been warriors, but they were also people with a rich spiritual life, one that integrated the divine with the everyday in ways that were as intricate as the knotwork carvings on their longships. As we drift through the echoes of ancient chants and the clinking of mead cups, remember that Norse religion wasn't just about gods and myths. It was about people, real people trying to make sense of a world where the line between the earthly and the divine was as thin as a raven's feather. And in that world, every sacrifice, every festival was a testament to their tenacity, their community, and their unyielding spirit. Now that we've navigated the Norse spiritual practices, let's dive headlong into their take on the afterlife, shall we? Picture this. You're a Viking warrior who's just clerked out in the most epic fashion, sword in hand, surrounded by the chaos of battle. Where do you go next? If you're lucky, it's Valhalla, the warrior's paradise. But hold on. Before you start packing your bags for this eternal rave in the sky, let's unpack what Valhalla really meant to the Norse folk and how it stacks up against other cultural afterlife beliefs. Valhalla, often glorified as the ultimate Viking reward, is a hall located in Asgard, ruled over by Odin himself. But getting there wasn't as easy as snagging a front row ticket to a rock concert. It was reserved for those who died in battle, a kind of celestial VIP list curated by Odin's hand-picked Valkyries. These fierce maidens would scoop up the fallen warriors from the battlefield and deposit them in Valhalla, where the warriors would spend their days in endless combat and their nights feasting on boar and mead. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, only if your idea of paradise includes daily death matches and an all-you-can-eat buffet where the menu never changes. Now, let's step back from the myth and look at the gritty reality. The concept of Valhalla was more than just Viking bravado. It served as a motivational tool. Think about it. If you're raiding monasteries or defending your homestead, the promise of Valhalla might just give you that extra push to swing your axe a little harder. It's like dangling a carrot, or in this case, a flagon of mead, just out of reach to ensure loyalty and bravery in battle. This belief system was an ingenious way to encourage warriors to face death unflinchingly. And in a society where warfare was as common as winter snow, the allure of Valhalla was as much about psychological control as it was about spiritual reward. But let's not get too swept away by the romanticized views of Viking heaven. The harsh reality is that not every Viking got the Valhalla treatment. In fact, most didn't. The majority of Norse folk ended up in Hell, a realm presided over by Loki's daughter. Hell wasn't exactly a punishment, but it wasn't the warrior's paradise either. Picture Hell as the Norse version of the suburbs, quiet, uneventful, and a bit dreary. While Valhalla was all about action and honor, Hell was more of a resting place for those who died of old age or illness. This sharp contrast between Valhalla and Hell highlights the Norse emphasis on warrior culture. In a world where the line between life and death was often as thin as a Viking sword, the promise of an afterlife befitting a fighter was a powerful motivator. But it's also a stark reminder that the Norse perspective on death was deeply intertwined with their social values. Honor and bravery in life were rewarded in the afterlife, reinforcing the societal expectation that courage was the highest virtue. Let's zoom out for a second and compare the Norse beliefs with other contemporary cultures. Take the ancient Egyptians, for example, who were all about the afterlife as well. But instead of a warrior's paradise, they envisioned a peaceful eternity in the field of reeds, accessible through a series of meticulous burial rituals and the correct recitation of spells. The Egyptians invested heavily in their pyramids and tombs, spending fortunes on ensuring a comfy afterlife. Meanwhile, the Norse seemed to take a more rugged approach, focusing less on earthly possessions and more on valor and deeds. Then there's the Greco-Roman perspective, where the afterlife wasn't nearly as alluring. Hades, the underworld, was a bit like the DMV of the afterlife. Everyone ended up there, but it wasn't anyone's idea of a good time. Unlike the Norse, who reserved their best digs for warriors, the Greeks and Romans had a more egalitarian approach, with places like the Elysian Fields reserved for heroes and the virtuous. What's fascinating here is how these afterlife beliefs influenced behavior in the real world. For the Norse, the promise of Valhalla was a double-edged sword. It encouraged bravery, yes, but it also fueled their reputation as fierce and often ruthless warriors. This mindset could justify raids and battles, as they weren't just acts of aggression, but potential tickets to paradise. It's a classic case of religion serving as both a carrot and a stick, shaping societal norms and personal choices in profound ways. As we peel back the layers of the Norse afterlife, it becomes clear that these beliefs were more than just spiritual concepts. They were deeply woven into the fabric of Viking life, influencing everything from individual actions to broader cultural practices. The myth of Valhalla, while romantic in its promise, also exposed the harsh realities of a society where survival often hinged on strength and valor. Yet, it's crucial to remember that these beliefs weren't static. They evolved over time, influenced by contact with other cultures and the shifting tides of history. As Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia in the late Viking Age, the Norse pantheon and their associated afterlife beliefs began to adapt. The conversion wasn't overnight, more like a slow burn, but it eventually reshaped the spiritual landscape of the region. In the end, the Norse view of the afterlife is a testament to their resilience and adaptability. It reflects a society that valued strength, honored bravery, and faced the unknown with a mix of fearlessness and pragmatism. As we continue to explore the Norse world, let's keep in mind that their beliefs about death and what came next were as complex and multifaceted as the people themselves. This exploration doesn't end here. We'll continue to unravel the tapestry of Norse culture, delving into their myths, their legends, and the realities they faced. Through it all, we'll see that the Norse weren't just warriors. They were storytellers, thinkers, and dreamers, navigating a world as unpredictable as the northern seas. So, stay tuned as we sail further into the depths of their history, with more tales to tell and truths to uncover. Now, let's ride the longship of history into the turbulent waters of Norse conversion to Christianity, an affair as smooth as a Viking raid during a thunderstorm. The narrative often tells us that the Norse simply saw the light, ditched their guards, and embraced Christianity with open arms and hallelujahs. But hold on to your helmets, because the reality was a lot more like a Game of Thrones plot twist than a Sunday school story. First, let's get real about the why behind this conversion drama. Spoiler alert, it wasn't about the Norse suddenly getting a craving for communion wafers. The truth is, the shift was driven by a mix of political power plays, economic incentives, and social pressures that would make even Machiavelli raise an eyebrow. Take Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark in the 10th century, as a prime example. The man wasn't just famous for his dental hygiene or for inspiring the name of your wireless tech. Around 965 AD, Harold decided he'd seen enough of the old guards and converted to Christianity. But let's face it, Harold wasn't overwhelmed by divine revelation. He was playing a political chess game. By converting, he reinforced alliances with the powerful Holy Roman Empire, which was a bit like getting a golden ticket to the European VIP lounge. These alliances brought economic benefits and military support, giving Harold a leg up in the brutal Game of Thrones that was medieval Scandinavia. But Harold wasn't alone on this conversion train. Olaf Tryggvason, King of Norway from 995 to 1000 AD, took conversion efforts to a whole new level. Olaf, a man as subtle as a berserker with a battle axe, decided that Norway should be Christian, and he didn't take no for an answer. His approach to spreading the good news was less about gentle persuasion and more like a crusade on steroids. Olaf's playbook included forcing local chieftains to convert or face the sword, an altar call with a distinct lack of choice. The Battle of Esvalda in 1000 AD, where Olaf met his demise, was a coalition of those who weren't thrilled with his heavy-handed methods. Olaf's story is a reminder that the road to salvation was often paved with political maneuvering and quite literally blood. Now, let's talk economics, because nothing says divine intervention like a boost to your bottom line. Christianity wasn't just a spiritual upgrade. It was the medieval equivalent of a trade agreement. By aligning with Christian Europe, Viking leaders could tap into new trade networks, gain access to better weapons, and see an influx of wealth that made the loot from a raid look like spare change. Tithes replaced sacrifices, and churches began popping up like mushrooms in the Scandinavian landscape, each one a sign of shifting power and wealth. But what about the everyday Norse folk, those hardy souls who were just trying to get through another brutal winter without becoming ice sculptures? For many, conversion was less about personal faith and more about survival. Imagine being a farmer in a remote fjord, and suddenly your local chieftain is telling you the old guards are out, and the new one is in. You're not about to argue when your livelihood depends on staying on his good side. Plus, the church offered something the old ways didn't: social services. If you were down on your luck, the church could provide food and shelter, services that were as tempting as a warm hearth in a snowstorm. Yet, despite the political and economic incentives, the transition wasn't seamless. Old habits die hard, and the Norse had a deep-rooted cultural identity tied to their gods and myths. They didn't just toss out Thor's hammer for a cross overnight. Many practiced a bit of spiritual hedging, keeping one foot in the old religion while dabbling in the new. You might say they were spiritual multitaskers, covering all bases, just in case the Christian guard turned out to be as moody as Odin on a bad day. The saga of Norse conversion is a vivid illustration of how religion, politics, and economics are inextricably linked. The Norse didn't just flip a spiritual switch. They navigated a complex transformation that was far from peaceful or straightforward. It's a tale of human resilience, adaptability, and the ever-present quest for power and prosperity. As we continue to explore this fascinating period, remember that the story of Norse conversion is as much about the earthly as the divine. It's about the interplay of power, money, and belief systems in a world where survival was never guaranteed. And it's a powerful reminder that history is rarely as simple as it seems. So, stay tuned as we venture further into the shifting sands of Norse history, where legends and reality collide in a dance as complex as a Viking knot. And so, we sail into the charpy seas of Norse legacy, a domain where ancient myths and modern imaginations collide like two longships in a fjord. It's a place where Thor's hammer flies not just in Viking raids, but across comic book pages and cinema screens. While the Norse gods have long since retired from active duty, their stories endure, captivating us with tales of epic battles, cosmic cows, and trickster antics. But why do these myths stick with us like a well-thrown boomerang? Let's unpack the cultural suitcase and see what's inside. First, let's talk about the sheer drama of Norse mythology. It's got everything: a pantheon of gods with more issues than a reality TV family, world-ending prophecies, and a creation story that sounds like it was penned by a heavy metal lyricist. This isn't your average bedtime story. The Norse tales are raw, rugged, and unapologetically human. They resonate with us because they reflect the chaos and unpredictability of life itself. In a world where everyone's grappling with their own metaphorical giants, who wouldn't be drawn to stories where even gods struggle and sometimes fail? Now, onto the economic and social threads that kept these myths alive long after the last Viking ship sailed. As Christianity swept through Scandinavia, the Norse gods didn't just vanish into the mist. Instead, they took on new roles in folklore and local traditions. When the Christian monks weren't busy copying the Bible, some of them scribbled down the old sagas, preserving them for future generations. How's that for irony? The very institution that replaced the Norse gods also helped keep their stories alive, a testament to human curiosity and the power of storytelling to transcend even religious divides. Fast forward to today, and you'll find Norse mythology in everything from blockbuster movies to video games, where Odin swaps his ravens for pixels and Loki's mischief gets a Hollywood makeover. And let's not ignore the branding. Thor's hammer is practically a logo at this point, appearing on everything from jewelry to tattoos. It's a marketing triumph that would make any modern PR guru proud. When you strip it down, the myths offer a timeless appeal. Heroes battling impassable odds, the allure of mysterious realms, and that ever-present question of fate versus free will. But let's not forget the gritty historical reality that underpins all this. The Vikings, after all, weren't just about poetry and pantheons. They were savvy traders, explorers, and yes, occasionally fearsome raiders. Their mythology reflects a people who lived on the edge of survival, where the next harvest or raid could mean the difference between feast and famine. Romanticized view of Vikings as noble warriors overlooks the harsh and often brutal realities of their world. Yet, it's precisely these harsh realities that add depth to the myths, grounding them in a world that was as unpredictable as a North Sea storm. The enduring legacy of Norse mythology also lies in its flexibility. These tales have been retold, adapted, and reimagined countless times, each version reflecting the values and fears of its era. In the age of empire, they became stories of conquest and exploration. In the modern world, they resonate with themes of identity and belonging as people search for roots in an increasingly globalized society. The myths have become a cultural Rorschach test, revealing more about the storytellers than the stories themselves. And let's have a moment for the sheer resilience of the Norse worldview. Here was a society that didn't just endure the biting cold and long winters, they thrived in it. Their myths, with all their complexity and contradictions, reflect a people who faced the world's hardships head-on. In the Norse cosmos, nothing was certain. Not even the gods were immune to fate. This acceptance of life's unpredictability is perhaps the most compelling lesson these stories offer today. In an age of constant change and uncertainty, the Norse remind us that chaos is not just inevitable, but a catalyst for growth and creativity. So, as we wrap up this saga, let's remember that the Norse myths are more than just stories of gods and heroes. They're a window into the hearts and minds of people who navigated a world as beautiful as it was brutal. They offer lessons in resilience, adaptability, and the enduring power of storytelling to connect us across time. Whether you're a fan of Thor's cinematic escapades or just someone who appreciates a good epic, there's something in these tales for everyone. So, the next time you see a lightning bolt or feel the chill of a winter wind, give a nod to the Norse, those ancient storytellers who understood that sometimes the best way to face the chaos of life is with a story, a song, and a little bit of mischief. In the dusty lanes of Medellin, Spain, a young Hernán Cortés probably never imagined he'd become the poster child for ambitious misadventure. The year was 1485, and little did anyone know, this small town would produce a man whose actions would ripple across continents. Cortés was born into a minor noble family, which, in the grand hierarchy of Spanish society, was like being the least popular member of a rock band. Sure, you've got some status, but good luck getting backstage at the royal court. Fast forward to his teenage years, and Cortés was sent to the University of Salamanca. This was kind of like sending a kid to Hogwarts, only without the magic and with way more Latin conjugations. He was supposed to study law, but let's just say his attendance record was about as sparty as a Dalmatian. Cortés wasn't exactly the academic type, and after 2 years, his scholarly pursuits fizzled like a damp firecracker. He returned to Medellin, not with a degree, but with a head full of dreams of adventure, and a heart set on something far more lucrative than legal briefs. In 1504, with the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning, Cortés set sail for the New World, leaving behind the comforts of Spain for the unpredictable wilds of the Caribbean. The voyage across the Atlantic was no luxury cruise. Think more along the lines of a floating sardine can, where the food was questionable, the quarters cramped, and the risk of scurvy ever present. After a grueling trip, he landed in Hispaniola, which is today the Dominican Republic and Haiti. This was his first taste of the New World, and it was here he cut his teeth as a notary, a far cry from the swashbuckling life of adventure he envisioned. But hey, everyone's gotta start somewhere, right? Cortés's real break came in 1511 when he joined Diego Velázquez on the expedition to Cuba. Now, Velázquez was not the easygoing boss type. He was more of the I expect results kind of leader, and he took a liking to Cortés, who quickly rose through the ranks. However, Cortés wasn't exactly the poster boy for reliability. He managed to get himself into a few tight spots, including a rather infamous incident involving a lady love, which nearly cost him his life. You see, Cortés had a knack for finding trouble, much like a moth finds flame. He was once jailed for, shall we say, romantic indiscretions, and only narrowly escaped hanging. Talk about living life on the edge. In Cuba, Cortés amassed some land and wealth, but the hunger for more gnawed at him. Enter 1518, when he heard whispers of the riches of the Aztec Empire, and suddenly, Cuba seemed as exciting as a Sunday afternoon nap. Velázquez initially granted him the authority to lead an expedition to the mainland, but true to form, Cortés managed to get on Velázquez's bad side. Cortés had this tendency to rub people the wrong way, like sandpaper on a sunburn. Velázquez tried to revoke his command, but Cortés wasn't about to let a little thing like authority get in his way. In a move that screams plot twist, Cortés set sail anyway with a fleet of 11 ships, about 500 men, a few cannons, and a whole lot of nerve. You know, just your usual operation for a guy who couldn't even keep a job at a university. This impromptu departure was basically the 16th century version of quitting your job and starting your own company. But his ambitions were as vast as the ocean he sailed on, and the potential for glory and gold was simply too tempting to resist. So there he was, Hernan Cortés, a man of questionable judgment and undeniable charisma, setting the stage for one of history's most audacious conquests. He was a blend of daring adventurer and cunning opportunist, a man whose life would become a series of improbable escapades, each more outrageous than the last. And as he left Cuba in the rear-view mirror, he was determined to rewrite the story of his life and the history of the world. So there he was, Hernan Cortés, steering his fleet towards destiny, or possibly disaster. It was 1519, and Cortés had just made landfall on the shores of what we now call Mexico, near the modern-day city of Veracruz. Now, if you're picturing a grand arrival with trumpets blaring and flags unfurling, hold that thought. It was more like a ragtag bunch of adventurers disembarking onto a beach that was as inviting as a Monday morning. Sand, sun, and a whole lot of uncertainty stretched before them. Cortés wasted no time in making his mark. He famously burned his ships, or at least that's the story that's been passed down through the ages. The reality, he scuttled most of them, which is a fancy nautical term for sinking them on purpose. Why? To eliminate any thoughts of retreat among his men. A bit like deleting all your social media apps to force yourself to focus on work. It was a bold move, one that screamed, "No turning back now, gents." This act of supposed bravado is often painted as a motivational speech with kindling and matches, but the truth is, it was as much about necessity as it was about inspiration. Cortés knew that, with Velázquez's pursuit likely on his tail, a quick escape plan was off the table. With ships out of the picture, the next chapter of this epic began with a diplomatic shuffle that would make a modern politician blush. Cortés's first major encounter was with the Tartanacs, a group not exactly thrilled with their Aztec overlords. The Aztecs, you see, had a tax system that would make even the IRS seem like a gentle hug. The Tartanacs, sensing an opportunity in Cortés, rolled out the welcome mat, or at least the 16th century equivalent. Cortés, ever the charmer, played the part of liberator. He promised to help them shake off the Aztec yoke, and just like that, he had his first set of allies. But Cortés wasn't just a one-trick pony. Enter Malintzin, or La Malinche, a woman who was as pivotal to his success as any sword or cannon. It was a Nahua woman who became not only his translator, but also his advisor, and eventually his consort. The romanticized stories paint her as a traitor or a seductress, but the reality is she was a survivor, navigating a world that was rapidly changing around her. Her linguistic skills and cultural knowledge were invaluable to Cortés, giving him a communication superhighway in a land of linguistic backroads. Now, let's talk economics for a moment. The allure of gold wasn't just a subplot, it was the whole plot. The Spanish crown was hungry for wealth, and Cortés had dollar signs, or rather, peso signs, in his eyes. Rumors of the Aztecs' vast riches were more than just whispers in taverns. They were gospel to the Spanish adventurers. This was less about cultural exchange and more about the exchange rate. Cortés's men were promised a cut of the treasure, a dangling carrot that kept them marching forward, fueled by the prospect of unimaginable wealth. Of course, for the indigenous populations, this economic exchange was less about profits and more about survival. Cortés's trek inland was a masterclass in opportunistic diplomacy. He knew that the Aztec Empire was a patchwork quilt of different tribes and city-states, many of which were less than thrilled with their Aztec rulers. His strategy, divide and conquer, baby. He forged alliances with the Tlaxcalans, a fierce people who had resisted Aztec domination with the kind of stubbornness that would make a mule proud. The Tlaxcalans were no pushovers. They gave Cortés a run for his money in initial skirmishes. But once they realized the benefits of an alliance, they joined forces in a partnership that was as much about mutual distrust of the Aztecs as it was about friendship. At this point, Cortés was like a political chameleon, adapting to each new situation with a mix of charm and calculation. The romantic image of the Conquistador as a dashing hero is seductive, but the truth is much more Machiavellian. Cortés wasn't just charming, he was shrewd, using every tool in his arsenal to build a coalition strong enough to challenge the Aztec Empire. However, the path to glory was littered with obstacles, and not just the geographical kind. Velázquez, still smarting from Cortés's unauthorized jaunt, sent a force to arrest him. Cortés, in true drama queen fashion, managed to convince many of these soldiers to join him instead, turning potential foes into allies. It was a recruitment strategy straight out of a corporate playbook. Hostile takeover meets team-building exercise. As Cortés and his growing band of allies moved closer to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Cortés wasn't just gambling with his own future. He was betting on the course of history itself. By now, his reputation had spread, and he was as much a figure of legend as he was a living, breathing conquistador. But the real question was, would he be the hero of his own story, or just another footnote in the chronicles of conquest? The seductive tales of Cortés's charisma and cunning often gloss over the sheer audacity of his quest. Here was a man who, with a few hundred soldiers and a motley crew of indigenous allies, was challenging an empire of millions. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and the stakes were as high as the peaks of the Sierra Madre. As we leave Cortés on the brink of his showdown with destiny, it's worth remembering that history is written by the victors. The romanticized version of Cortés as a swashbuckling hero is tempting, but the reality is far more complex. Cortés was a man driven by ambition and greed, a product of his time, navigating a world where the lines between savior and conqueror were as blurry as a foggy morning in the Gulf of Mexico. And so, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations. Cortés, with his motley crew of allies, stood on the precipice of a new world, ready to either reshape it or be swallowed by it. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in this saga is about to unfold, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. So there they were, Cortés and his ragtag band of adventurers, standing on the doorstep of destiny, with the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan shimmering on the horizon like a mirage of gold. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. This journey was less about destiny and more about diplomacy, deceit, and a dash of desperation. Cortés knew that marching straight up to the Aztecs and knocking on Moctezuma's door would be akin to selling ice to an Eskimo, passable, but you'd better have a darn good pitch. Enter La Malinche, the linguist extraordinaire who could turn Cortés's awkward Spanish into poetic Nahuatl. She wasn't just translating words, she was crafting narratives, shaping the story Cortés wanted to tell. Her role was pivotal, and without her, Cortés would have been as effective as a mime at a karaoke night. Now, about those political maneuvers. Cortés was pulling strings like a master puppeteer, with alliances that were more tangled than a box of Christmas lights. He played the Tartanacs, the Tlaxcalans, and other indigenous groups like an orchestra, each one a different instrument in his symphony of conquest. The myth is that Cortés was a genius strategist, but the reality is more murky. Sure, he was savvy, but he was also ruthless, often resorting to intimidation and coercion. Case in point, when he suspected dissent among his ranks, he didn't hesitate to execute a few to set an example. Think of it as medieval corporate restructuring, brutal but effective. And then there was the matter of tribute. The Aztecs loved their tribute system, which was essentially a high-stakes game of pay up or else. Cortés, ever the opportunist, promised relief from these burdens to the tribes he courted, dangling the promise of freedom like a carrot in front of a very hungry mule. But let's not pretend he was a liberator. He was simply replacing one overlord with another, swapping Aztec oppression for Spanish subjugation, just with a different menu of demands. Cortés's manipulation was not limited to his indigenous allies. He was a maestro of misinformation, spreading stories to his own men about the supposed weakness of the Aztecs. He painted Moctezuma as indecisive and cowardly, a ruler who could be toppled with a well-placed nudge. This wasn't entirely accurate, of course, but in the fog of ambition, facts often take a backseat to fervor. Cortés was a legend in his own mind, and he wanted his men to believe in that legend too. It was like a motivational seminar, but with more swords and less PowerPoint. Economic motivations were never far from the forefront of Cortés's mind. The Spanish crown had its eyes on the prize, the fabled wealth of the Aztecs. Cortés promised his men a share of the spoils, a shiny incentive that kept morale high and questions at bay. Gold fever was a powerful thing, and Cortés wielded it like a sword. Of course, the reality of conquest meant that riches weren't just lying around waiting to be picked up. The men would have to fight for their share, and Cortés was more than willing to let them bleed for it. As the march continued, Cortés's entourage grew, a melting pot of soldiers, indigenous allies, and the occasional curious onlooker. It was like a medieval road trip, complete with all the drama and none of the GPS. They navigated through dense forests, over treacherous mountains, and across rivers that seemed to conspire against them. But Cortés pressed on, driven by ambition and a healthy dose of audacity. He was gambling big, and the odds weren't exactly in his favor. Cortés's approach to Tenochtitlan was both a literal and figurative high-wire act. He had to balance the expectations of his Spanish backers with the realities on the ground, a task that required more dexterity than a circus performer. His alliances were fragile, held together by promises and threats, and at any moment the whole enterprise could come crashing down. But fortune favored the bold, and Cortés was nothing if not bold. As they neared the Aztec capital, the scale of what lay ahead began to sink in. Tenochtitlan was a marvel, a city built on an island in the middle of a lake, accessible only by causeways. It was a metropolis of pyramids and palaces, bustling with life and commerce. For Cortés and his men, it was like walking into a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. The Aztecs were formidable, their empire vast, and their military prowess well known. But Cortés was undeterred. He had come too far to turn back now, and besides, he had burned that particular bridge, quite literally, back in Veracruz. The march into Tenochtitlan was not a triumphant parade, but a strategic maneuver, one that required every ounce of cunning Cortés could muster. He was a man walking a tightrope, with the promise of glory on one side and the abyss of failure on the other. The romantic image of the Conquistador as a fearless hero is tempting, but the truth is more complicated. Cortés was a man driven by ambition and greed, his path littered with both allies and adversaries, each one a stepping stone on his journey to power. And so, the stage was set for the next act in this historical drama, a confrontation that would test the limits of Cortés's ambition and the resilience of the Aztec Empire. As they prepared to enter Tenochtitlan, the stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome was anything but certain. The legend of Cortés is one of triumph and tragedy, a story as complex as the man himself. But for now, the march continued, and with each step, Cortés edged closer to the moment that would define his legacy. Stay tuned, because this tale is far from over, and the next chapter promises more twists and turns than a Mexican mountain road, as Cortés and his entourage of hopeful conquistadors and wary indigenous allies approached the gates of Tenochtitlan. Anticipation hung in the air, thicker than the jungle humidity they had just left behind. The city was a dazzling spectacle, a Mesoamerican metropolis that made even the most seasoned traveler stop in their tracks. But don't let the gleaming temples and bustling marketplaces fool you. Cortés wasn't here for the sightseeing. Oh no, he had much grander plans. Moctezuma Roman II, the Aztec emperor, was no stranger to omens and prophecies. The arrival of these strange, pale-skinned visitors had all the hallmarks of a cosmic event foretold by the stars, or so the legend goes. In reality, Moctezuma was caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to balance diplomacy with defense. He decided to welcome Cortés as a guest, a move that in hindsight might have seemed as wise as inviting a fox into the henhouse. But let's cut him some slack. Moctezuma was dealing with an unprecedented situation, and Cortés came armed with gifts and promises, not to mention the persuasive powers of La Mélange. Inside the city, things started off almost civil. Cortés was given the royal tour, and the Spaniards marveled at the Aztecs' engineering prowess. Tenochtitlan was like Venice with fewer gondolas and more pyramids, a city built on a series of islands connected by causeways, with aqueducts and floating gardens that would make any urban planner drool. But Cortés wasn't here to admire the scenery. He was here to do business, the kind that involved gold, glory, and a hefty dose of double-dealing. The initial warmth of their welcome quickly cooled, however, as Cortés and his men realized that the Aztecs weren't about to hand over their treasures without a fight. So, in a move that would make Machiavelli proud, Cortés took Moctezuma captive within his own palace, turning the emperor into a puppet ruler. You might wonder how one goes about capturing an emperor without causing a riot. Well, it involved a mix of strategic flattery, intimidation, and the ever-handy threat of violence. Moctezuma agreed to stay with the Spaniards voluntarily, though one can only imagine what kind of persuasive arguments were used. With Moctezuma under house arrest, Cortés effectively held the keys to the kingdom, or so he thought. This bold maneuver was driven by more than just a lust for power. It was economic calculus, pure and simple. By controlling the emperor, Cortés aimed to control the flow of tribute and wealth, not to mention securing a bargaining chip against any Aztec insurrections. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was a hostile takeover of the highest order. Cortés was playing a high-stakes game, and the price of failure was a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, Velázquez was fuming. Cortés had gone rogue, and Velázquez wasn't about to let this insubordination stand. He sent an expedition led by Panfilo de Narváez to bring Cortés back in chains. Cortés, however, was a master of improvisation. He left a small garrison in Tenochtitlan and marched out to confront Narváez. In a classic Cortés move, he managed to turn the tables, convincing many of Narváez's men to switch sides, sweetening the deal with promises of riches that were as tangible as the air they breathed. But while Cortés was playing diplomatic chess, things in Tenochtitlan were going south fast. Pedro de Alvarado, left in charge, handled things with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. During a religious festival, he ordered a massacre of Aztec nobles, fearing an uprising. Predictably, this sparked outrage and rebellion. The city erupted in chaos, and the Spaniards found themselves besieged in the very palace they had once occupied with such swagger. Cortés returned to a city teetering on the brink of revolt. Moctezuma, hoping to quell the unrest, addressed his people from the palace rooftop, urging them to lay down their arms. But the emperor's pleas fell on deaf ears, and in a twist worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, he was struck by a stone thrown by one of his own subjects. Moctezuma died shortly after, and with him any hope of a peaceful resolution. The Spaniards, now led by a beleaguered Cortés, had to make a hasty retreat. La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, was anything but a gentle evening stroll. On June 30, 1520, under the cover of darkness and a torrential downpour, Cortés and his men attempted to sneak out of the city. But the Aztecs were ready. The retreat turned into a rout, with the Spaniards suffering heavy losses as they tried to cross the causeways. Precious gold and silver, meant to be their ticket to wealth, ended up at the bottom of Lake Texcoco, a costly reminder that greed often comes with a hefty price tag. The economic motivations behind Cortés's campaign were now laid bare. The pursuit of treasure had driven them into this quagmire, and the glittering promise of wealth was now sinking alongside their comrades. For the indigenous societies, the impact was devastating. The social fabric of the Aztec Empire was unraveling, and the Spaniards' arrival set off a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to its downfall. The romantic notion of the noble conqueror fades quickly when faced with the brutal realities of conquest, where diplomacy is a prelude to domination and alliances are as fragile as cobwebs in a storm. But the story doesn't end here. Cortés, ever the survivor, regrouped with the help of his indigenous allies, who had as much reason to destabilize the Aztec power as he did. And the Aztecs, they were left to pick up the pieces, their empire shaken but not yet broken. La Noche Triste was a turning point, a night of sorrow for the Spaniards, but also a testament to the resilience of the Aztec people. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. The battle for the heart of the Aztec Empire was far from over. In the aftermath, Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, licking his wounds and plotting his next move. He knew that the road to victory was a marathon, not a sprint, and his ambition burned as fiercely as ever. The legend of Hernán Cortés was being written in real time, a tale of triumph and tragedy, greed and glory. Yet, for all his cunning and charisma, Cortés was just a man, driven by the same desires that have spurred countless others throughout history. And as he prepared for the next chapter in his conquest, the world watched and waited, the fate of an empire hanging in the balance. Stay tuned, because this historical drama is far from its final act. As Cortés regrouped in Tlaxcala, it was clear that his audacious gamble had turned into a high-stakes chess game where the pieces were people, and the board was an empire on the brink. With Moctezuma gone and the Spaniards licking their wounds, the Aztecs, led by the new Tlatoni, Cuitlahuac, were not about to roll over and play conquered. The stakes had never been higher, and the fall of Tenochtitlan was about to be as dramatic as a telenovela finale. By the time Cortés was ready to strike again, in the spring of 1521, he had amassed a force that was a motley mix of hardened Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies. He had learned his lesson. Brute force wouldn't cut it. This time, he brought with him a fleet of 13 brigantines, built on the shores of Lake Texcoco, ready to lay siege to the city from the water. It was the 16th century version of upgrading from a slingshot to a missile launcher. These ships were his ace in the hole, allowing him to control the waterways and cut off the city's supplies. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted a grueling 93 days, a testament to the Aztecs' resilience and Cortés's relentless determination. The Spaniards methodically dismantled the city, block by block. Cortés had figured out that the key to victory lay in isolating the city from its resources. His forces destroyed aqueducts and blocked causeways, ensuring that the once thriving metropolis was starved of both water and food. It was a war of attrition, and the Aztecs, despite their bravery, were caught in a vice. The economic undercurrents of the conquest were as murky as the waters of Lake Texcoco. For the Spanish crown, this was about more than just planting a flag on new soil. It was about the gold, the silver, and the vast resources that could fill the royal coffers. Cortés understood this well, and his men were driven by the promise of riches that lay just beyond the crumbling walls of Tenochtitlan. But for the Aztecs, this was about survival, about defending their way of life against invaders who seemed as unstoppable as a force of nature. The city's fall on August 30, 1521, was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of a civilization. Cuitlahuac had succumbed to smallpox, a disease brought by the Europeans that ravaged the indigenous population with a ferocity that no sword or spear could match. The new leader, Cuauhtémoc, fought valiantly, but the writing was on the wall, or rather, the pyramids. The Aztec Empire was crumbling, and Cortés's victory was as inevitable as it was tragic. In the aftermath, Tenochtitlan was left in ruins, its streets littered with the remnants of a once great empire. The Spanish had succeeded in their quest for domination, but at what cost? The city was rebuilt as Mexico City, the new capital of New Spain, but the cultural and human loss was incalculable. For the indigenous peoples, the arrival of the Conquistadors was an apocalypse, a cataclysmic event that reshaped their world forever. As the dust settled, Cortés found himself both a hero and a villain, celebrated for his conquest and reviled for his methods. The man who had once been a minor noble in Spain was now the Marqués del Val d'Oaxaca, a title that came with vast lands and wealth. But the romantic image of Cortés as a daring explorer masks a darker reality. He was a man of his time, driven by ambition and greed, willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. His legacy is as complex as the man himself, a blend of courage and cruelty, brilliance and brutality. The broader implications of his conquests were profound. For Spain, the riches of the New World fueled an era of unprecedented expansion, but it also sowed the seeds of future challenges. The influx of gold and silver led to inflation and economic instability, a classic case of biting off more than you can chew. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples faced a new reality, one where their cultures were subjugated and their societies irreversibly altered. The Spanish brought with them not just new weapons and diseases, but new systems of governance and religion that would forever change the fabric of the Americas. In the grand tapestry of history, Cortés is a figure who inspires both admiration and abhorrence. His story is one of ambition gone awry, a cautionary tale of what happens when the pursuit of power overrides all else. And yet, his legacy endures, woven into the very fabric of the modern world. The myths that surround him are as seductive as they are misleading, painting a picture of a man who was both hero and villain, conqueror and colonizer. As we reflect on Cortés's legacy, it's worth pondering how history chooses its heroes. Is it the deeds they accomplish, or the stories we tell about them? Cortés was a man who seized his moment, for better or worse, and in doing so, he altered the course of history. Whether we view him as a visionary or a villain, his impact is undeniable. So there you have it, the saga of Hernan Cortés, a tale that is as much about the man as it is about the myths that surround him. As you drift off to sleep, ponder the complexities of legacy and the enduring power of stories to shape our understanding of the past. Because in the end, history is not just a record of what happened, but a reflection of who we are. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your own adventures be as epic, though perhaps a bit more peaceful, than those of the infamous Conquistador. So you're an executioner in medieval Europe. Congratulations, or maybe condolences are more appropriate. You've landed a job that's both indispensable and, let's be honest, pretty grim. It's not exactly the childhood dream, unless your dream involves a lot of public spectacle, societal exclusion, and, well, a distinct lack of friends. But hey, every job has its perks, right? Your career path into this line of work, it's as twisted as a pretzel at Oktoberfest. See, becoming an executioner wasn't something you applied for with a neat resume and a cover letter. Nope, it was more like fate deciding to play a cruel joke. Often, the job was hereditary, passed down like a cursed family heirloom. If your dad swung the axe, guess what, kiddo? You're next in line. And if you were really lucky, you might inherit the family sword too. But let's not get too wrapped up in the romance of the old family traditions. The truth is, executioners were often shunned by society. You were like the medieval version of a dentist. People needed you, but they didn't really want to hang out with you. Your neighbors might tolerate you out of necessity, but invitations to the local medieval barbecue, don't hold your breath. You were crucial for law and order, yet social life was mostly a solo gig. Think of it as the original work-from-home job, minus the comfy pajamas. Now, let's talk economics. Because why else would anyone choose a job that involves ending lives in front of a cheering or jeering crowd? Money, my friend. Cold, hard medieval cash. Executioners were typically paid per head. Literally. In some parts of Europe, you could earn quite the tidy sum, with records showing payments of 24 groschen per execution in 15th century Germany. That's not chump change, especially when the average daily wage for a craftsman was about a single groschen. But before you start imagining yourself rolling in dough, remember that keeping that cash was akin to navigating a minefield. See, the perks came with high social costs. You were often given a house on the outskirts of town, away from the respectable folk. This was the Middle Ages equivalent of living on the wrong side of the tracks. And don't even think about dating. Your romantic prospects were about as promising as a snowball's chance in a blacksmith's forge. Marrying into another family was tricky and often required hefty dowries, because hey, who wouldn't want to pay extra to marry the town executioner? The social stigma was so intense that even your kids might have a hard time shaking it off. Your family might be forever branded with the mark of the axe. Sure, you might have some job security, but at the cost of being the town's necessary evil. You were feared, yes, but not respected. Now, let's bust a myth or two. The image of executioners as heartless brutes is a bit exaggerated. In reality, many were trained to be precise and efficient. It was an art form of sorts. A quick, clean execution was the goal, not just for your professional pride, but to avoid public unrest. An execution gone wrong could lead to chaos, and nobody wanted that, least of all you. No pressure, right? And forget the hooded figure stereotype. The famous black hood is mostly a Hollywood invention. Sure, some executioners might have worn masks, but more often than not, they were barefaced, known to everyone. Your identity wasn't a secret. Your job was your identity. People might not have liked you, but they sure knew who you were. Think of it as the medieval version of being a celebrity chef. Everyone knows your name, but they might not want to invite you over for dinner. Your work was a public service, albeit one that came with a side of existential dread. You were a cog in the wheel of justice, vital yet vilified. So, as you prepare for another day on the gallows, remember that your role, though solitary and grim, was a linchpin of medieval society. You were the embodiment of law and order, the steady hand that ensured justice was served. Your life might have been a lonely road, but it was one paved with the peculiar honor of an outcast who held the power to decide life and death. And that, my historically curious friend, is why it truly sucked, and oddly fascinated, being a medieval executioner. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of your daily grind, because wielding the executioner's sword wasn't just about swinging steel with the grace of a medieval ballerina. It was an art, that required a toolbox worthy of a grim museum exhibit. First on the list was the executioner's sword, a weapon that wasn't just about flash and fear. These swords were broad, flat, and weighed about 3 to 4 pounds. Unlike the swords you might picture in a knight's hand, these had no point. Why? Because poking was for knights, and your job was all about the clean chop. You needed precision, not a pointy end. The average blade was about 3 feet long, offering just the right amount of leverage to ensure a swift, decisive end. After all, even in the Middle Ages, there was an emphasis on efficiency. But the sword was just one tool in your grim repertoire. When it came to executions, variety was the spice of life, or death in your case. The axe was another go-to, especially in England, where the chopping of heads was practically a national pastime. The block and axe combo was like the medieval version of peanut butter and jelly, a classic pairing that got the job done with brutal efficiency. The axe was less graceful than the sword, but effective, weighing in at around 5 to 7 pounds, with a handle about 3 feet long. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart or weak of arm. And let's not forget the infamous gallows. Hanging wasn't just about tying a knot and hoping for the best. The logistics were more complex than assembling flat-pack furniture. You needed to calculate the drop length to ensure a quick end. Too short, and it was a painful strangulation. Too long, and you risked decapitation. Talk about a balancing act. The drop length was typically around 6 feet, but it varied depending on the condemned's weight and height. Precision was key. Your reputation depended on it. Now, about that myth of the bloodthirsty crowd. Sure, public executions were the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster matinee, but the reality was more nuanced. Yes, crowds gathered, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or even thousands, but not everyone was there for the spectacle. For many, it was a grim necessity, a civic duty to witness justice served. But let's be real, some were definitely there for the drama, the medieval version of reality TV, minus the rose ceremonies. The pressure on you, the executioner, was immense. One slip-up could turn a routine beheading into a messy debacle. Imagine swinging that sword or axe while the peanut gallery scrutinized your every move. It's like trying to parallel park while the entire town watches. Not to mention, botched executions could lead to riots. If the crowd felt the condemned suffered unduly, they might turn on you faster than you could say off with his head. You were expected to deliver justice with the precision of a Swiss watch, under penalty of becoming a target yourself. And then there's the myth of the cold-hearted executioner, which deserves a second look. Sure, you had to be tough. This wasn't a job for the squeamish. But many executioners were surprisingly human. Some offered the condemned a final prayer or a sip of wine to steady their nerves. Others might even take a small bribe to ensure a swift end. It was a peculiar mix of mercy and mercenary, where compassion met capitalism. The reality was that your job was less about bloodlust and more about maintaining order. You were an enforcer of the law, the necessary evil that kept chaos at bay. In a world where the rule of law was often as flimsy as a medieval card piece, your role was critical. Without you, justice could devolve into mob rule. So, while your profession might have been painted in shades of horror, it was also a pillar of societal stability. And let's not overlook the political ramifications. Executions were often public statements, a show of power by the ruling class. You were the instrument through which kings and queens demonstrated their authority. The stakes were high, literally life and death. A botched execution could be seen as a sign of weakness, a crack in the facade of power. So, no pressure, right? Next time, we'll dig deeper into the social dynamics that put you at the center of medieval power plays while keeping you at arm's length from polite society. Because being an executioner wasn't just about swinging the axe. It was about navigating a complex world where you were both reviled and revered. Stay tuned, because the medieval world has plenty more surprises in store for those who dare to look beyond the myth. And speaking of surprises, let's delve into the tangled web of political and social dynamics that medieval executioners had to navigate. You see, being the guy with the axe wasn't just about brawn. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and discretion. In a world where allegiances could shift faster than a knight could draw his sword, executioners had to be as savvy as they were strong. Let's start with the Reformation, because if you thought your job was straightforward, think again. This was a time when Europe was playing a religious game of tug-of-war, with Protestant reformers and Catholic loyalists yanking on the rope. These shifts had a direct impact on your work, not to mention your neck. The Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, sent ripples across the continent. For executioners, this meant a change in clientele. Suddenly, heretics were part of the job description, and if you were in a Protestant region, those heretics might just be Catholics, or vice versa. Confused yet, you weren't alone. The executioner's job wasn't just about following orders. It was about understanding the ever-changing political landscape. You had to know who was in power and what that meant for your work. Inquisitions and witch hunts were all the rage, and you were the guy making sure the fires were lit and the gallows were sturdy. It was a precarious position. Mess up, and you might find yourself on the wrong side of the pyre. But do it right, and you were seen as an enforcer of divine will. Talk about job pressure. Now, let's talk reputation. Executioners were essential yet reviled, a paradox that would give even a philosopher a headache. You were necessary for maintaining order, but social gatherings, forget it. You were like the bouncer at a club nobody wanted to enter. Yet, some executioners managed to leverage their position for influence. Take Franz Schmidt, the infamous Nuremberg executioner in the late 16th century. This guy kept meticulous diaries, documenting his executions, 394, if you're counting, and interactions. His records were so detailed that they gave him a voice in legal matters. Yes, an executioner with a say in the law. Schmidt turned his notoriety into authority, advising on legal reforms, and even earning the respect of the Nuremberg town council, who knew that swinging a sword could lead to a seat at the table. Of course, not everyone could pull off such a coup. Many executioners were trapped in a cycle of social isolation, where their essential service didn't translate to social acceptance. You were like the necessary evil everyone wanted to keep at arm's length. Sure, you might get a nod of acknowledgement, but an invite to the local feast. Not unless they're serving irony for dessert. It was a life on the fringes, where you were both feared and indispensable. Yet, some executioners found ways to navigate this murky social terrain. Let's not forget the economic dynamics at play. While executioners were paid per job, the Reformation and other political upheavals could affect the crime rate, and consequently, your income. Fewer executions meant less pay, and with all the upheaval, stability wasn't exactly on the menu. But in some regions, executioners moonlighted as torturers or took on other roles, like maintaining public order. It was a hustle, but it kept the coins coming in. Despite the stigma, executioners occasionally found ways to integrate into their communities, albeit with caveats. They might be granted certain privileges, like tax exemptions or the ability to sell goods that others couldn't. In some cases, executioners were allowed to deal in unclean trades, like tanning or butchery. These were jobs considered dishonorable, but for an executioner, honor was already a moot point. You took what you could get. And let's not overlook the family angle. Executioners often married within a small circle, usually other executioners' families, to avoid dragging outsiders into their social exile. It was a closed community, but it offered a sense of solidarity. It wasn't uncommon for executioners to form networks, sharing information and support across towns and regions. Imagine a medieval LinkedIn for executioners, minus the motivational posts. So, while wielding the axe was a solitary endeavor, it wasn't without its complexities and connections. The executioner was a figure both feared and needed, a fulcrum on which the scales of justice precariously balanced. As you sharpen your tools and prepare for another day of grim work, remember that your role, while isolating, was a linchpin in the chaotic dance of medieval politics and society. You were more than just the hand that swung the sword. You were a pivotal player in a world where power was as transient as a shadow in the moonlight. In the next part, we'll delve deeper into how executioners maneuvered their precarious positions, sometimes turning social pariah status into unlikely influence, and other times finding themselves inextricably caught in the political machinations of the time. Stay tuned, because the world of the medieval executioner is as layered as it is morbidly fascinating. So, you're on the job, standing there with your trusty axe or sword, and you've got a head to chop. No big deal, right? Except, oh wait, it kind of is. Because while you might be the medieval equivalent of a necessary evil, or a grim reaper with a side gig, The mental toll isn't something you can just brush off with a cold pint of ale. Let's dig into the psychological quagmire that being an executioner really was. Imagine being the one person in town who could make people cross the street to avoid you. It's like being stuck in a perpetual Halloween, but instead of candy, you're handing out existential dread. And sure, you might be thinking, hey, at least they're not asking me to lend them a cup of sugar. But surprise, this kind of isolation can mess with your head faster than you can say, off with his head. Historical records, like those infamous diaries of Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner, give us a peek into this grim mental landscape. Schmidt's detailed accounts reveal a man deeply aware of the gravity of his role. He noted the number of executions he performed, 394, if you want a chilling reminder of job security, and his meticulous documentation suggests a man trying to find order in chaos. It's as if by recording every detail, he was attempting to compartmentalize the trauma. Now, let's talk coping mechanisms. Executioners weren't exactly lining up for therapy sessions. Freud wouldn't be around for another few centuries, but they had their own ways of dealing with the mental strain. Some turned to religion. In an ironic twist of fate, the executioner often doubled as a spiritual guide. Offering a final prayer to the condemned wasn't just for show. It was a way to find solace in a higher power. It's like trying to find peace in the knowledge that you're part of a divine plan, even if that plan involves swinging a blade. Alcohol was another coping mechanism, and let's face it, drowning your sorrows in a tankard of ale seems like a natural choice, especially when your day job involves, well, drowning others in sorrow. But here's the kicker. Excessive drinking could lead to mistakes on the job, and as we've established, botching an execution was a big no-no. So, executioners had to tread carefully, balancing the fine line between a little liquid courage and a reputation-shattering hangover. Family ties were another thread in this complex tapestry. Executioners often married within their own ranks, creating a circle of understanding and shared experience. It was like a grim version of a support group, where everyone knew the stakes and the stigma. But this insular existence could also magnify the weight of societal rejection, creating a pressure cooker of emotions that could easily implode. The stigma didn't just stick to the executioner. It clung to their families like medieval mud. Children of executioners often found themselves tarred with the same brush, struggling to shake off the shadow of the axe. This generational burden was a heavy one, stifling opportunities and perpetuating the cycle of exclusion. Imagine trying to make friends on the playground when your dad's the guy responsible for last week's public spectacle. Not exactly a social icebreaker. And let's not forget the paradoxical nature of their role. Executioners were needed yet ostracized, a duality that could lead to a serious identity crisis. You were both the instrument of justice and its most visible enforcer, a walking contradiction that could easily lead to feelings of isolation and depression. It's like being the goalie on a soccer team where no one wants to pass you the ball, and when they do, it's only because they absolutely have to. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect is how some executioners manage to turn their pariah status into a peculiar kind of influence. Take Franz Schmidt, who, through his meticulous records and undeniable skill, gained a voice in legal matters. Schmidt transformed his notoriety into a form of authority, advising on legal reforms and earning the respect of the Nuremberg Town Council. It's a remarkable feat, akin to taking your seat at the table after being the one who sets it. Yet, not every executioner had Schmidt's savvy, and for many, the role remained a lonely one, shackled by societal judgment and personal demons. So, as the medieval executioner navigated their grim reality, they did so with a mix of resilience, resourcefulness, and resignation. Their world was one of stark dichotomies, where they were both indispensable and invisible, powerful yet powerless. The mental burden was heavy, but for those who managed to find a sliver of acceptance or authority, it was a testament to their tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds. And as we continue to unravel the layers of this macabre profession, remember that the story of the executioner is as much about survival as it is about death. In the next part, we'll delve further into how these figures maneuvered their precarious positions, sometimes turning social pariah status into unlikely influence, and other times finding themselves inextricably caught in the political machinations of the time. So stay tuned, because this medieval saga has plenty more tales to tell, each as complex and compelling as the last. And so we arrive at the twilight of the medieval executioner's heyday, when swinging a sword for justice was about to trade its place in the sun for a spot in the history books. As societies evolved, so too did their appetite for blood-soaked theatrics. You see, by the 17th and 18th centuries, the world was starting to have second thoughts about making executions the main event of the social calendar. The Enlightenment was knocking on the door, and with it came a shift in how justice was administered. It was like society collectively decided it was time to grow up and take the violence down a notch. Public executions, once the medieval equivalent of a blockbuster movie, complete with snacks and a crowd, began to lose their luster. Governments started realizing that maybe, just maybe, parading brutal punishments wasn't the best look. It didn't help that these events could easily turn into PR disasters. A botched hanging or a wayward axe swing had the potential to incite riots rather than instill order. Talk about backfiring. So, as the 19th century rolled in, many countries began moving executions behind closed doors, far from the prying eyes of the public. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Take France, for example. In 1832, they decided that decapitation via guillotine would be the only legal method of execution. The guillotine itself is a fascinating piece of machinery. Despite its grim purpose, it was actually considered quite humane, quick and efficient, like the espresso of executions. But in 1939, France finally said, enough is enough, and shifted executions from public squares to prison courtyards. It was like moving a concert from a stadium to a lounge. A bit more intimate, a lot less scandalous. The United States followed a similar trend. By the early 20th century, most states had outlawed public executions. The last known public execution in the U.S. took place in 1936 in Owensboro, Kentucky, where the unfortunate Rainey Bethia was hanged in front of 20,000 onlookers. The spectacle was such a debacle that it essentially put the final nail in the coffin for public executions in America. After that, executions were moved indoors, away from the public's gaze, in an effort to maintain some semblance of decorum. As societies grappled with these changes, they also began rethinking the very concept of the death penalty. In the wake of World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 put human dignity and the right to life at the forefront of public discourse, sparking debates that continue to this day. Countries worldwide started re-evaluating whether the death penalty was a relic of a more barbaric past or a necessary deterrent to crime. Fast forward to today, and public executions are all but extinct in much of the world. The death penalty itself is on shaky ground, with more countries abolishing it, or, at the very least, putting a moratorium on its use. As of 2023, 109 countries have abolished the death penalty for all crimes, while others reserve it for the most heinous offenses. It's like watching the world slowly wake up from a nightmare, realizing that maybe the answer to crime isn't more violence, but more justice. But what about the executioner's legacy? Surprisingly, traces of it still linger in today's legal systems, albeit in subtler forms. The role of the executioner, with its mix of authority and revulsion, has morphed into the modern-day legal and correctional systems, where the emphasis is on rehabilitation over retribution. The shadow of the executioner's hood can be seen in the procedural and methodical nature of law enforcement and legal proceedings. The focus on due process and the right to a fair trial echoes the days when the executioner needed to be precise to avoid public unrest. And let's not overlook the psychological impact. The stigma and isolation faced by medieval executioners find echoes in the mental health struggles of those working in today's justice system. Guards, lawyers, even judges, who grapple with the weight of their responsibilities. It's a reminder that while the tools of justice have evolved, the emotional toll remains a constant. As for the myth of the executioner, that too endures, albeit in a sanitized form. Hollywood and literature continue to romanticize the figure, turning executioners into anti-heroes with a moral compass as sharp as their blades. It's a testament to our fascination with the duality of justice, where the line between right and wrong is as blurred as ever. So, there you have it. The medieval executioner, once a crucial cog in the wheel of justice, has been relegated to the annals of history. Yet their legacy persists, a reminder of a time when justice was as swift as it was brutal. As we continue to evolve, the challenge remains to balance justice with humanity, to ensure that the lessons of the past inform the progress of the future. After all, history has shown us that justice is not just about punishment, it's about understanding, growth, and above all, compassion. And while we may never fully escape the shadows of our past, we can always strive to cast a brighter light on the path ahead. The sun creeps over the horizon, casting its first sleepy rays onto the deck of a 16th century Spanish galleon. If you've ever wondered what it's like to wake up on such a vessel, let me tell you, it's nothing like the romanticized images of adventure and conquest. Instead, your day begins in the dim, cramped quarters shared with a dozen other sailors, all of whom are vying for a breath of fresh air in the stifling, salty musk that blankets everything. You roll off your hammock, if you're lucky enough to have one. Hammocks were a game changer, by the way. Before their introduction to European ships, sailors were stuck sleeping on hard planks, which did wonders for crew morale, said no one ever. But don't get too comfortable. Space is at a premium. The galleon might be a floating fortress, but it's also a floating slum. Conditions are tight, and privacy is non-existent. You're packed in like sardines in a barrel, and you can thank the ship's architects for that marvelous design decision. They prioritized cargo space for precious metals and goods over your comfort. After all, who needs personal space when there's gold to be had? As you navigate your way to the deck, you're hit with a scent that makes you question all your life choices. The hygiene situation. Let's just say it leaves a lot to be desired. Bathing is more of a theoretical concept than a daily ritual. Fresh water is a luxury you can't afford to waste on trivialities like cleanliness. Instead, you make do with a quick splash of seawater, which does little more than rearrange the dirt on your skin. Toothbrushes. You'd be lucky to find a stick to chew on. The phrase minty fresh won't enter the seafaring lexicon for a few more centuries. Breakfast awaits, so it's off to the ship's galley, if you can call it that. Feeding a ship full of sailors on limited supplies is less about culinary art and more about survival. Your menu: hardtack biscuits and salted meat. Hardtack, for the uninitiated, is a flour-based brick of sustenance. It's so hard you might chip a tooth if you're not careful. Pro tip: soak it in whatever liquid you can find to soften it up. The meat, salted beyond recognition to preserve it on these long voyages. Fresh produce is a fleeting memory, long gone after the first weeks at sea. Scurvy, anyone. Vitamin C is nowhere to be found, and the resulting vitamin deficiency is a silent menace lurking in the shadows. The galleon is a complex beast, a floating microcosm of society with its own hierarchy. At the top sits the captain, a mini-monarch ruling over his wooden kingdom. The captain's word is law, and questioning it could land you in some hot water or worse. Below him, the officers, who act as his enforcers, ensuring that discipline is maintained among the crew. They're the ones you have to impress if you ever want to climb the ladder. But let's be real, as a common sailor, your chances of promotion are as slim as the rations. Your pay. Let's just say it's not going to make you a rich man. A sailor's wages might amount to a few ducats per month, barely enough to send home, let alone save for a rainy day. And this paltry sum is supposed to compensate for the very real risks you face: storms, shipwrecks, disease, and the occasional encounter with pirates. Adventure has its price, and it's often paid in hardship and peril. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a camaraderie among the crew that's forged in the crucible of shared adversity. You might not be living the high life, but there are moments of levity and laughter. Sea shanties echo across the deck as you work, the rhythm of the songs keeping time with the laborious tasks of manning the ship. There's a strange comfort in the routine, in knowing that your shipmates are in the same soggy boat as you. As the day unfolds, you find yourself caught in the rhythm of the sea, a relentless, undulating dance that's both soothing and unsettling. The ship creaks and groans like an old beast, each sound a reminder of the precariousness of your journey. You glance at the horizon, a seemingly endless expanse of blue that stretches beyond the limits of your imagination. It's a world full of possibilities and dangers, where legends are born and myths are shattered. By evening, you're bone-tired, your muscles aching from the day's labor. But there's a certain satisfaction in knowing you've made it through another day. You retreat to your hammock, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin anew, another chapter in the grand, gritty saga of exploration. The age of exploration is often painted as a time of swashbuckling heroics, but the reality is much more nuanced. It's a story of survival, of ordinary men braving extraordinary circumstances in pursuit of the unknown. And as you drift off to sleep, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring in this vast, unpredictable world. And speaking of the unpredictable, let's talk about navigating the vast, featureless expanse that is the open ocean. The phrase "all at sea" exists for a reason after all. As you find yourself back on deck in the afternoon, the sun high in the sky, casting sharp shadows, it's time to delve into the curious art of navigation, or the lack thereof, that defined this era of exploration. Forget GPS or even a reliable compass. The age of exploration was more about hoping for the best than knowing what you're doing. First up, the tools of the trade, the astrolabe and the quadrant. These were the medieval equivalents of a smartphone map app, albeit ones that required a working knowledge of astronomy. The astrolabe, an ancient instrument dating back to the Greeks, was used to measure the altitude of the sun or a star above the horizon. Not exactly user-friendly, but it was the best option available. The quadrant served a similar purpose, looking suspiciously like a school protractor, only bigger and with more nautical flair. By calculating the angle of celestial bodies, these tools could help you determine your latitude. Latitude, mind you, not longitude. So you knew how far north or south you were, but your east-west position was anyone's guess. Longitude, the ultimate navigational enigma, wouldn't be reliably measured until the 18th century, thanks to John Harrison's marine chronometer. Before that, it was a bit like playing pin the tail on the donkey, with your ship as the donkey and the tail as any semblance of certainty. You'd rely on dead reckoning, a fancy term for educated guesswork, factoring in your speed, time, and direction. If you thought counting steps was hard, try doing it in nautical miles. Now about those maps, or charts, as the sailors called them. Picture a child's crayon drawing, and you're not far off. Cartography was part science, part art, and a whole lot of imagination. Maps were full of hopeful guesses and creative liberties. They boldly included mythical sea monsters, krakens and leviathans, more as a warning or a whimsical flourish than anything factual. It was a bit like having a treasure map where the X marks the spot, but the spot is in a completely different ocean. But let's not be too harsh on those early map makers. They were working with limited information, and their efforts were nothing short of heroic. The famous Peary Rise map, for instance, dating from 1513, is a tantalizing glimpse into how the world was perceived. It showed parts of Europe, Africa, and the New World with surprising accuracy, considering it was pieced together from older maps and sailors' tales. Yet, it also depicted the coast of Antarctica, without ice. Talk about getting ahead of yourself. The crew's faith in these maps and tools was bolstered by the stars themselves. The North Star, or Polaris, was a beacon for navigators in the northern hemisphere, a constant in a world of uncertainty. But venture too far south, and Polaris dipped below the horizon, leaving the Southern Cross to guide you, if you could spot it amidst the myriad of stars. Astronomy was the Google Maps of the day, with constellations providing the only reliable guideposts in the vast, uncharted sea. Let's not forget the compass, that trusty needle dancing on its pivot, always pointing north. It wasn't foolproof. Magnetic north wandered about like a debutante at a ball, but it was a godsend compared to the alternative, getting hopelessly lost. In fact, Christopher Columbus himself, whose voyages in the late 15th century are often romanticized, wasn't immune to navigational missteps. On his first journey in 1492, Columbus thought he was heading to Asia, only to stumble across the Bahamas, a slight detour of about 8,000 miles. Oops. Now about that swashbuckling adventurer myth. Picture this, a gallant captain, eyes scanning the horizon, confident in his course. Reality check. Captains were often as clueless as the rest of the crew, relying on luck as much as skill. The romantic image of the all-knowing navigator is a bit like believing all pirates had a parrot and a peg leg. Fun to imagine, but mostly fiction. The truth was, early explorers faced a constant, gnawing uncertainty. Every day at sea was a gamble, a roll of the dice. There was no guarantee you'd make it to your destination, or even back home. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, the first to circumnavigate the globe from 1519 to 1522, is hailed as a triumph of exploration. But the cost? Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, and only one of his 5 ships made it back to Spain. A high price for a place in the history books. The economic stakes were high, too. These voyages were expensive, funded by monarchs or wealthy patrons with an eye on the prize. Spices, gold, new trade routes. A successful expedition could mean untold wealth and glory, but failure could spell financial ruin. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. It was a high-stakes game of maritime poker, with lives and fortunes on the line. Yet for all the uncertainty, there was a certain allure to the unknown. The call of the sea was irresistible. It was a chance to escape the confines of land, to chase horizons and dreams. This was an era when maps were being redrawn, when the world was expanding in dizzying ways. For the sailors, each voyage was a step into the unknown, a chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. They were the pioneers of their time, blazing trails across uncharted waters. But let's not sugarcoat it. The reality was harsh, and the sea was an unforgiving mistress. Storms could rise without warning, tossing ships about like toys. Disease lurked in the cramped quarters, ready to claim the weak. And then there were the pirates, the real ones, not the Hollywood kind, with eyeliner and witty one-liners. These were ruthless opportunists, prowling the seas for plunder. The threat was ever present, a reminder that the ocean was a frontier as wild and lawless as any land. So, as you stand on the deck, peering into the distance, it's easy to see why the mythology of the age of exploration remains so compelling. It's a narrative of daring and discovery, of pushing boundaries and rewriting the known world. But beneath the surface lies a story of human struggle and survival, of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. It's a tale of ambition and folly, of dreams and reality colliding on the high seas. And as the sun begins to set, casting a golden glow over the water, you're reminded of the delicate balance between adventure and adversity. The horizon beckons, a tantalizing promise of new lands and possibilities. But the road, or rather, the sea, was fraught with peril and unpredictability. Each journey was a leap of faith, a test of endurance and skill. And the question that lingered in every sailor's mind was simple. Would they make it home to tell the tale? There's more to explore, more stories to unravel. The age of exploration is far from over. The night is young, and the sea is vast. So, stay with me as we continue this journey, peeling back the layers of history to reveal the truths hidden beneath the waves. After all, the world is a big place, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. As we drift further into the age of exploration, let's untangle the web of economics that fueled these daring voyages. Spoiler alert, it's less about the heart of a lion and more about the lure of lucrative spices and gleaming gold. This wasn't a grand adventure for adventure's sake. It was a high-stakes business venture with profit margins that would make even the savviest Wall Street brokers salivate. First, let's talk spices. Think of them as the Bitcoin of the 16th century. Nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were the real deal, commanding prices that could rival precious metals. To give you a taste, a pound of nutmeg in Europe could fetch up to 7 fattened oxen or a small house. Yep, you heard me right. These tiny flavor bombs were worth their weight in gold, making them the ultimate status symbol for the European elite who craved exotic flavors to spice up their otherwise bland diets. The spice trade was a global game of monopoly, with each nation racing to control the board. The Portuguese, spearheaded by Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1498, initially had the upper hand. They established a sea route around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, bypassing the overland Silk Road, which was as fraught with tolls and tariffs as a modern-day highway. This sea route was a gold mine, or should I say, a nutmeg mine, ushering in a century of Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean trade. But the Spanish, not to be outdone, had their eyes on a different prize: gold. The tales of cities paved with gold in the Americas were as enticing as they were exaggerated. Fueled by dreams of El Dorado, Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro set sail for the New World. Their exploits against the Aztec and Inca empires were brutal and transformative. Cortés's conquest of the Aztecs in 1521 and Pizarro's of the Incas in 1533 brought an influx of precious metals into Spain that would make Scrooge McDuck's vault look like chump change. These metals, however, came at a horrifying cost. The indigenous populations were decimated by disease, warfare, and enslavement. The price of Europe's golden age was paid in the blood and tears of countless native peoples. It's a grim reminder that the pursuit of wealth often leaves a trail of devastation in its wake. Now, you might be wondering, who footed the bill for these extravagant escapades? Monarchs like Spain's Queen Isabella and Portugal's King Manuel were eager investors, viewing these expeditions as surefire ways to fill their coffers. But they weren't alone. Wealthy merchants and financiers, akin to today's venture capitalists, threw their money into the pot, hoping for a hefty return on investment. This wasn't philanthropy. It was capitalism at its finest, or perhaps its most ruthless. These voyages were the original startup ventures, with all the risk and reward that entails. For every successful expedition that returned laden with spices or gold, there were numerous failures. Ships were lost to storms, scuttled by pirates, or simply vanished without a trace. The financial stakes were astronomical, and a single voyage could make or break fortunes. And let's not forget the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, a papal decree that divided the world between Spain and Portugal like a cosmic game of risk. Spain got the Americas, minus Brazil, which was snagged by Portugal, while Portugal claimed Africa and Asia. This neatly drew battle lines for a century of rivalry, each nation scrambling to outdo the other in the race for riches. The economic motivations behind these voyages were clear: power, prestige, and profit. The romance of discovery was a convenient narrative, a story to inspire sailors and secure funding. But beneath the veneer of adventure lay cold, hard economics. Exploration was a means to an end, and that end was wealth. In this relentless pursuit, the explorers themselves were both pawns and players. Figures like Columbus, Magellan, and Da Gama became legends, their names etched into history. Yet they were also products of their time, driven by personal ambition and the promise of glory. For them, the risks were worth the potential rewards. But let's not get carried away with tales of heroism. These were complex figures operating in a cutthroat world. Columbus, for instance, was less the noble adventurer and more a savvy opportunist, securing funding from Spanish royalty by promising to find a new route to Asia. And when he stumbled upon the New World instead, he spun it as a triumph, despite never realizing the magnitude of his discovery. The age of exploration was a time of contradictions, a blend of idealism and avarice, of noble quests and ruthless exploitation. It reshaped the world, redrawing maps and forging new connections. The economic impact was profound, laying the groundwork for the global trade networks that define our modern economy. So, as you ponder the legacy of these daring voyages, remember that the reality was as gritty as it was grandiose. It was a time of soaring ambitions and staggering costs, of fortunes made and lives lost. The explorers set sail in search of wealth and power, but their journeys also opened the door to a new era of globalization. In their wake, they left a world forever changed. And as the night deepens, with the stars as our only witness, we continue our voyage into the past. There's more to uncover, more stories to tell. So, stay with me as we navigate the turbulent waters of history, where myth meets reality, and the truth is often stranger than fiction. The sea may be vast, but our journey is far from over. And speaking of voyages, let's delve into what happened when those European ships finally reached foreign shores. The arrival of these massive wooden leviathans was as much a spectacle then as it would be today seeing a UFO land in your backyard. Imagine the sheer awe and curiosity of the indigenous peoples as they witnessed these floating behemoths, and the band of bedraggled sailors who emerged from them, looking more like they'd been spat out of the ocean than having mastered it. First contact was often a curious affair. Picture it, two groups, each staring at the other with a mix of fascination and skepticism. The Europeans, with their strange garb, pale skin, and questionable hygiene, must have appeared as oddities. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples, with their unfamiliar customs and languages, were seen through the lens of European preconceptions and misconceptions. It was a meeting of worlds that would be both enriching and catastrophic. Initially, these encounters were often marked by mutual curiosity and a tentative exchange of goods. Europeans were eager to trade their metal tools, beads and trinkets for local wares like food, spices, and in some cases, gold. The indigenous peoples, on the other hand, were curious about these new visitors and their strange possessions. To the Europeans, trading a few baubles for exotic goods seemed like a savvy deal. But let's be honest, presenting a handful of shiny beads in exchange for valuable resources was more than a little patronizing. Trade, however, was the opening act in a much larger drama. As European ships made repeated visits, these initial exchanges set the stage for more structured trade relationships. This wasn't just swapping goods over campfires. It was the early stirrings of a global economy. Europeans introduced new crops and animals, reshaping local agriculture and diets. Horses, for instance, transformed many indigenous cultures, especially in the Americas, where they became central to the way of life for many plains tribes. But if you thought these encounters were all sunshine and rainbows, think again. Underneath the veneer of trade and exchange lurked darker motives. The Europeans were not merely visitors, but conquerors in waiting. Driven by the insatiable demand for land and resources, they often saw indigenous peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than partners in mutual prosperity. The narrative of peaceful discovery often overlooks the brutal reality of these interactions. Consider the Spanish conquistadors, who didn't just come bearing gifts, but also guns and germs. Hernán Cortés's landing in Mexico in 1519 is a textbook case. With a small force of around 500 men and a few horses, Cortés toppled the mighty Aztec Empire. The use of superior weaponry played a role, but let's not forget the silent ally, disease. Smallpox, measles, and other old-world diseases decimated the indigenous populations, who had no immunity to these new threats. It's estimated that up to 90% of some native populations were wiped out, a grim testament to the devastating impact of such encounters. Of course, not all interactions were immediately hostile. In some regions, alliances were forged, often out of necessity. Explorers like Samuel de Champlain in Canada relied on alliances with indigenous tribes like the Huron to survive and establish French colonies. These partnerships were strategic, often pitting one indigenous group against another to further European interests. It was a classic case of divide and conquer, played out on a grand scale. Yet, let's not paint the indigenous peoples as mere victims in this narrative. They were active participants, navigating these new relationships with a blend of caution and opportunity. Many indigenous groups were adept at playing European rivals against each other, securing better trade terms or military alliances. They were not passive recipients of European expansion, but dynamic actors in their own right. Still, the power dynamics were heavily skewed. European colonization was not just a physical occupation, but a cultural imposition. The spread of Christianity, often by force, sought to replace indigenous beliefs and practices. Missionaries, with their fervor and fanaticism, saw themselves as saving souls, but in the process, they often trampled over centuries-old traditions and customs. It was cultural imperialism, masked as benevolence. And then there were the outright conflicts. The history books are full of wars and skirmishes that erupted as indigenous peoples resisted European encroachment. The Pequot War in New England, King Philip's War, and countless others show that resistance was fierce and often bloody. These conflicts were brutal, characterized by massacres and atrocities on both sides. The romantic notion of peaceful coexistence is as mythical as the unicorns that never graced those early maps. In the long run, these encounters reshaped both the old and new worlds. For Europe, the influx of new goods and wealth transformed economies and societies. The so-called Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus, was a two-way street. While Europe gained new foods like potatoes and maize that would become staples, it also sent back livestock, diseases, and Christianity. The Americas, Africa, and Asia were changed irrevocably. Indigenous societies were upended, their populations decimated, and their lands appropriated. New social hierarchies emerged, often favoring those who could align themselves with European powers. In Africa, the slave trade, fueled by European demand for labor in the New World, would rip apart societies and redefine the continent's future. So, as we unpack these cultural encounters, it's clear they were far from a simple tale of discovery. They were complex, fraught with conflict and cooperation, exploitation and exchange. The age of exploration wasn't just about finding new lands. It was about rewriting the world's story, for better or worse. And as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows on the deck, we realize that the legacy of these encounters is still with us. The world we know today, its borders, its cultures, its conflicts, was shaped by these voyages of discovery and conquest. It's a tangled web of human ambition and folly, a testament to our relentless drive to explore and dominate. But our journey doesn't end here. The seas are vast, and there's more to discover. So, stay with me as we continue to navigate the tumultuous waters of history, where the past is never truly past, and every wave carries the echoes of those who came before. The canvas of history is vast, a swirling tapestry where threads of exploration and exploitation intertwine, often indistinguishable until you pull them apart to reveal the stark contrasts within. The age of exploration, for all its romantic allure of daring adventurers and new worlds, was just as much about the harsh reality of human ambition and the relentless pursuit of power. As evening casts its shadow and the sea settles into a rhythmic lullaby, it's time to reflect on the broader legacy of these epoch-defining voyages. Let's be honest, the age of exploration was the original trigger for globalization. Picture it, a world where spices from the Maluku Islands, gold from the New World, and silks from China could end up on the same European dining table. It was the 16th century equivalent of Amazon Prime, only with a delivery time measured in months, if not years, and at the cost of human lives. Now, here's the kicker. While the allure of exotic goods and the promise of wealth drove European powers into a frenzy of exploration, the real jackpot was the global interconnectedness that emerged. These voyages laid the foundation for trade networks that would eventually stitch the world together into the complex quilt of today's global economy. But let's not get too cozy under that quilt without acknowledging the price paid by those who were steamrolled in the process. Take the indigenous populations, for instance. They were the unwitting hosts of this grand European party, only to find themselves outnumbered and outgunned by gatecrashers. The impact on these societies was catastrophic. We're talking about entire cultures erased, languages silenced, and traditions snuffed out like candles in a storm. The indigenous peoples were not mere footnotes in this narrative. They were central characters whose stories are too often overshadowed by the blinding spotlight on European exploits. And let's dig into some numbers. In the century following Columbus's arrival in the Americas, an estimated 90% of the native population perished, primarily due to disease. Smallpox, measles, and other old-world maladies were the uninvited guests at the table, leaving devastation in their wake. It was demographic collapse on an unprecedented scale, a chilling reminder of the consequences of these encounters. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the influx of New World silver, especially from the Potosi mines in present-day Bolivia, set off what economists like to call the price revolution. This not-so-fun economic phenomenon saw inflation rates soar and the cost of living skyrocketed. Picture your groceries doubling in price overnight, and you've got the gist. While the Spanish crown was tempted to dive into this silver bonanza like Scrooge McDuck, the reality was a bit more sobering. The wealth from the Americas was a double-edged sword, enriching some while impoverishing others and setting off a century of economic turbulence. But here's where things get interesting. This economic upheaval and the new global trade routes weren't just reshuffling coins in a purse. They were redrawing the map of power. Nations like Spain and Portugal initially reaped the rewards, but as the 17th century rolled in, the torch of maritime dominance passed to the Dutch and the English. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the world's first multinational corporation, wielding more power and influence than some countries today. It's a classic case of the apprentice becoming the master, as these northern European upstarts outmaneuvered their Iberian predecessors at their own game. And speaking of games, let's not forget the cultural chess match that ensued. The spread of European languages, religions, and technologies was as much about dominance as it was about discovery. The age of exploration was a cultural bulldozer, paving the way for European norms and values to be imposed across continents. The missionaries who followed in the explorers' wake were more than just spiritual guides. They were agents of change, often enforcing their beliefs with the zeal of salesmen who believed their product was the only one worth having. But this story isn't just about the winners and losers. It's about the shades of grey, those nuanced, often overlooked moments where cultures collided and sometimes coalesced. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, new hybrid cultures emerged, blending indigenous traditions with European influences. Think of it as cultural fusion cuisine, where the ingredients are the customs and the recipes are the interactions. These new societies were rich tapestries of resilience and adaptation, proving that human culture is as much about evolution as it is about preservation. Yet, for all the talk of cultural exchange, let's not pretend it was an equal partnership. The power dynamics were lopsided, with European interests often dictating the terms. It was less of a dialogue and more of a monologue, where the loudest voice drowned out all others. The age of exploration was a grand theatre of human ambition, but it was also a stark reminder of the price of progress, a price paid in suffering and subjugation. So, as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of the age of exploration, it's worth pondering how history chooses its heroes and villains. The romanticized legacy of explorers like Columbus and Magellan is as enduring as it is misleading. Their voyages are celebrated as triumphs of human spirit and ingenuity, yet they were also harbingers of colonization and conquest. It's a tale of two narratives, the one we tell ourselves and the one rooted in the gritty, often brutal reality. In the end, the age of exploration set the stage for the world as we know it. It was a chapter of human history written in the ink of ambition and curiosity, but also in the blood of those who stood in its way. Forces us to reckon with the dual nature of progress, how the same voyages that expanded horizons also narrowed them for countless others. As the stars twinkle above and the ship rocks gently on the waves, you're left with a choice: to see these explorers as either intrepid heroes or ruthless opportunists, or perhaps a bit of both. History is a mirror we hold up to ourselves, revealing not just where we've been, but who we are. And in the flickering light of that reflection, we find the eternal tension between the romance of exploration and the reality of its consequences. So, as you drift into sleep, consider this. Exploration may chart the course, but it's history that defines the journey. In medieval Europe, hygiene was less about cleanliness and more about survival. Picture a bustling city like Paris, where the population swelled to over 200,000 by the 14th century. Streets were narrower than your favorite Instagram filter, lined with buildings that leaned in like nosy neighbors, and the air was a cocktail of aromas that would make your eyes water, if not from the stench, then from laughter at the absurdity of it all. Now, within this charming chaos lay the brothels, the unsung heroes of the medieval economy, operating in the shadowy corners of society, where hygiene was more of a suggestion than a standard. Prostitutes, or ladies of the night, as they were euphemistically called, occupied a unique niche in this fragrant tapestry. They were both reviled and relied upon, filling the streets alongside merchants and beggars. In a world without modern plumbing, personal hygiene was a complex challenge, especially for those whose livelihoods depended on physical proximity. Public baths existed, but they were about as scarce as a medieval dentist. When they did exist, they were communal affairs, more party than hygiene ritual, where the bathwater was shared like a medieval hot tub. So, what did a lady do to keep clean? Well, soap, as we know it, was a luxury item. The average bar of soap in the 1,300 could cost as much as a loaf of bread, which was about a penny, a significant sum when your daily wage might just cover a meal. With such limitations, creativity was key. Prostitutes often resorted to aromatic herbs and flowers to mask odors, much like a medieval version of Febreze. Rosemary and lavender were especially popular, not just for their pleasant scents, but also for their perceived medicinal properties. And let's not forget the perfumes, which were less Chanel now. 5 and more eau de cover-up. Now, let's talk about water. Water, essential for life, yet paradoxically, a harbinger of disease. Medieval people were suspicious of water for good reason. Drinking it was like playing a bacterial roulette. Instead, they chugged beer and wine, safer due to the alcohol content. For washing, water was a necessity, albeit a tainted one. Even if you wanted to wash, you'd have to lug water from a well or river. And let's be real, Who has the energy for that after a long night of work? The cities themselves were designed like a medieval game's worst level. Open sewers ran alongside the streets, and waste disposal was a matter of tossing it into the nearest alley and hoping the neighbors didn't notice. In such an environment, staying clean was as much about social maneuvering as it was about physical effort. The prostitutes of medieval Europe, much like the cities they lived in, were a study in contrasts. They navigated the dual worlds of visibility and invisibility, where their services were both sought after and condemned. Cities like London and Paris operated state-sanctioned brothels, a pragmatic acknowledgement of the profession's inevitability. These weren't just places of ill repute. They were economic hubs where the social classes mingled in ways that would make a modern-day sociologist weep with joy. Despite their pivotal role, the women who worked in these establishments faced daunting challenges. Disease was rampant, with sexually transmitted infections like syphilis lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Medieval medicine offered little comfort, leeches, anyone, and the stigma attached to their profession meant they were often left to fend for themselves. Many were victims of circumstance, drawn to the city by the promise of work, only to find that the streets were less paved with gold and more with the refuse of reality. The life of a medieval prostitute was a delicate dance, a balancing act on the tightrope of society's expectations. They had to maintain an appearance that was both alluring and approachable, all while navigating the quagmire of medieval hygiene. It's no wonder that the creative solutions they devised often bordered on the desperate. These women were the original innovators, turning the limitations of their environment into a tapestry of survival strategies. As we peer into the murky waters of medieval hygiene, it becomes clear that the past was a complex blend of necessity and invention. The story of these women is not just about grime and grit, but about resilience and resourcefulness in the face of overwhelming odds. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, humanity finds a way to adapt and endure, often with a wry smile and a sprig of rosemary tucked behind an ear. And as we dive deeper into the medieval mire, let's talk money, everyone's favorite topic, right? Well, maybe not in the Middle Ages. For the women of the night, the economics of medieval prostitution were as complex as a Shakespearean plot twist, and just as unforgiving. First, let's talk about the price tag on these services. In 14th century Paris, a typical evening with a prostitute might set you back about 2 to 8 deniers. To put that in perspective, a laborer's daily wage hovered around 12 deniers. So, spending a night with a lady of the evening could cost you half a day's work or more. It wasn't exactly cheap, but neither was it exclusive to the aristocracy. The clientele was as diverse as a medieval tapestry, with everyone from merchants to squires seeking their company. But here's the kicker. These women weren't pocketing all that cash. Oh no, the medieval economy had its claws in everything, even the oldest profession. Brothels were often owned by wealthy patrons who took their cut, leaving the women with a fraction of what they earned. And let's not forget the taxes. Yes, you heard right. There were taxes on sex work. In cities like London, prostitutes paid regular dues to operate legally. These could range from a few pence to several shillings per month. The irony, they were taxed to ensure moral order, a bit like asking a fox to guard the henhouse. Now, before you start thinking that medieval tax collectors were just trying to make a quick buck, consider this. Regulating prostitution was also about controlling the chaos. Cities were growing faster than a medieval beard, and with that came a need for structure. By taxing and regulating brothels, authorities aimed to curb the spread of disease and maintain some semblance of public order. It was a medieval version of harm reduction, a pragmatic approach to an inevitable reality. The financial challenges didn't end with taxes and fees. Many of these women faced crippling debt. Imagine coming to the city, lured by the promise of opportunity, only to find yourself trapped in a cycle of borrowing and repayment. Some brothel keepers acted as loan sharks, advancing money for essentials like food and clothing at interest rates that would make a modern payday lender blush. It wasn't uncommon for a prostitute to be in debt for life, working just to pay off what she owed. What's more, the economic necessity driving women to this profession was often a matter of survival. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly a bastion of gender equality. Women had limited opportunities for work outside the home, and those available rarely paid enough to live on. For many, selling their services was less a choice and more a last resort. It was a way to gain some measure of economic independence, even if it came at a steep personal cost. And let's not romanticize the brothel life. While some establishments were relatively well run, offering protection and a community of sorts, others were veritable hellholes. The risk of violence was ever present, both from clients and those who ran the show. Disease was rampant, and medical care was as primitive as a trebuchet compared to modern standards. It's a grim picture, but one that deserves to be seen in all its gritty detail. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, many women found ways to exert agency in their lives. They navigated the labyrinthine systems of tax and regulation with a savvy that would make a modern-day accountant proud. Some even managed to save enough to buy their freedom or start a new life. They were survivors in a world stacked against them, displaying a resilience that's both inspiring and sobering. But don't be too quick to cheer the underdog victory. The social stigma attached to prostitution was as sticky as medieval mud. These women were often ostracized, living on the fringes of society, even as they played a crucial role in its economy. Their contributions were essential, yet their existence was mostly invisible in historical records, a testament to the hypocrisy of the times. As we peel back the layers of medieval prostitution, we find a microcosm of the broader socio-economic landscape. It's a story of power dynamics, of survival, and of the human spirit's tenacity. And while it's tempting to view it through a romanticized lens, the reality was far darker and more complex. These women weren't just colorful characters in a medieval drama. They were real people with real struggles, navigating a world that offered them few choices. So, the next time you think history is all dusty tomes and dry facts, remember the women who walked these streets. Their lives were anything but boring, and their stories are worth telling, not just for the scandal, but for the insight they offer into the human condition. Stay tuned, because we're just getting started on this journey through the medieval underbelly. There's more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. All right, so we've set the stage in our medieval drama, and now it's time to zoom in on the real puppet masters pulling the strings, the church and the state. At the heart of the medieval tapestry lay a sizzling contradiction society's insatiable desire for services rendered by prostitutes, juxtaposed with a persistent need to condemn them publicly. This dance of hypocrisy was choreographed by none other than the church and municipal authorities, who seemed to oscillate between moral outrage and pragmatic acceptance like a medieval metronome stuck on indecisive. First, let's talk about the church, the ultimate authority in matters of moral conduct, or at least it wanted to be. Picture this: the clergymen, clad in their flowing robes, wagging fingers and quoting scripture with the fervor of a modern-day Twitter rant. They decried prostitution as a sin, equating it to a gateway to hellfire, a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. Yet, behind the scenes, the church's attempts to stamp out the profession were about as effective as a knight in shining armor trying to sneak up on a dragon all show, no substance. The church's stance was grounded in doctrine, yet laughably impractical in execution. Consider the Council of Elvira around 306 AD, which declared that those who engaged in sinful behavior, including prostitution, were to be denied Eucharist until repentance. However, this rigid stance softened over the centuries, with the church eventually turning a blind eye to the economic necessity that drove many women to this line of work. After all, they needed their congregations full on Sundays. Then there were the municipal laws that read like a medieval game of whack-a-mole. Cities like Paris and London issued ordinances attempting to regulate the trade, not eradicate it. In 1254, Louis Roman IX of France issued an ordinance kicking prostitutes out of the country, only to have them quietly return when authorities realized the city's economy had taken a hit. It was like trying to banish pigeons from the city square, an exercise in futility. Instead of eliminating the profession, cities employed a tactic that would make Machiavelli proud: control the chaos. Municipal ordinances focused on where, when, and how prostitutes could operate. In 1358, Nuremberg decreed that brothels could only exist outside city walls, an attempt to keep the riffraff at bay while still acknowledging their existence. Meanwhile, Venice, the city of canals and romance, was less subtle. By the 15th century, their regulations had become so detailed that they practically required a flowchart to navigate. Yet the women themselves were not passive players in this grand farce. They became adept at exploiting loopholes, embracing the role of societal scapegoats with a resilience that would put a modern-day lawyer to shame. They knew the game and played it well, maneuvering through the labyrinth of laws like seasoned chess masters. Prostitutes often formed informal networks, supporting one another in a world that was less Game of Thrones and more Survivor, medieval edition. They navigated the murky waters of legality with savvy and wit, often playing off the very systems designed to suppress them. It was a delicate balancing act, staying just within the bounds of the law while pushing societal norms. This contradiction of condemnation and necessity created a cultural paradox. While prostitutes were often the subject of sermons and moral panics, they were simultaneously woven into the fabric of urban life. Their presence was both an open secret and a social adhesive, binding the disparate elements of medieval society together in ways that would make even the most complex tapestry look simple. The moral panic surrounding prostitution was fueled by its visibility and the fear of its potential to disrupt the social order. Every so often, the public's simmering anxiety would boil over, leading to crackdowns that were more performative than practical. It was as if society needed these occasional purges to convince itself of its own morality, even while turning a blind eye to the underlying economic and social realities. Despite the public outcry, the curious coexistence of prostitutes with the rest of society persisted. They mirrored the urban culture of the time, serving as a reminder of the stark inequalities and the resilience of those who lived on the margins. These women occupied a liminal space, straddling the line between acceptance and ostracism, morality and survival. The role they played in urban culture was as enigmatic as it was essential. As much as they were condemned from the pulpit, they were also celebrated in the bawdy songs and stories that filled the taverns and marketplaces. Their tales were told and retold, a testament to their enduring, if unofficial, place in the social hierarchy. What's more, they were often the unsung chroniclers of urban life, their stories reflecting the broader societal changes that shaped the medieval world. They bore witness to the rise and fall of fortunes, the ebb and flow of power, and the shifting sands of cultural norms. In many ways, they were the living archives of a time that was as tumultuous as it was transformative. As we dig deeper into the social and political factors influencing the perception of medieval prostitutes, it's clear that their story is one of contradiction and complexity. They were both reviled and revered, marginalized yet integral to the urban tapestry. Their existence challenged the very foundations of medieval morality, forcing society to confront its own hypocrisies and adapt to the realities of a rapidly changing world. So, while the church preached fire and brimstone and the state issued its edicts, the women of the night continued to walk their own path, navigating the treacherous terrain with a deftness that would make even the most seasoned diplomat envious. Their legacy is not just one of survival, but of resilience and adaptability in the face of a society that was as capricious as it was contradictory. Stay tuned, because there's much more to unearth in this medieval labyrinth, and trust me, the ride is far from over. As we meander further into the medieval maze, let's slice through the romanticized fog surrounding the so-called ladies of the night. You know, the ones often depicted in literature as mysterious, alluring figures draped in silk and mystery. In reality, their lives were more mud and muck than moonlit serenades. It's time to unravel the tapestry of myths and legends that have woven a gilded veil over the gritty truths of their existence. First up, let's tackle the literary legends. Medieval literature has a knack for painting prostitutes as either tragic heroines or devilish temptresses. Think less Pretty Woman and more Les Miserables with a side of the Scarlet Letter. Take Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, where the wife of Bath is depicted with a bawdy sense of humor and a knack for marital manipulation. Yet even her character, with its bawdiness and bravado, barely scratches the surface of the complex reality these women faced. The truth is, the real-life medieval prostitute was more likely to be found scraping together a living in the grimy streets than swanning about in velvet robes. Forget the poetic allure of the brothel as a den of intrigue. Most were more akin to overcrowded dormitories, where privacy was as rare as a unicorn. Imagine sharing a small, musty room with several other women, each trying to carve out a sliver of space for themselves. Romantic, right, and let's not even get started on the clientele. While tales of dashing knights and noble lords might make for good reading, the typical customer was more likely a tradesman or labourer, looking for a brief escape from the drudgery of daily life. These were not the grand romances of courtly love. Transactions were often as clinical as they were necessary, with the glimmer of gold, or more often, copper, exchanged for a moment's distraction. The reality was far removed from any notion of romance, underscoring the transactional nature of survival. Speaking of survival, it's worth noting that the romanticized image of the courtesan with a heart of gold was largely a creation of later centuries. In the Middle Ages, the idea of a prostitute as a woman of leisure and luxury was a fantasy, a tale spun by those who wished to see the world through rose-colored glasses. In reality, these women were often teetering on the edge of poverty, their daily existence a constant struggle against hunger and disease. And while we're busting myths, let's take a closer look at hygiene, or the lack thereof. Forget about the sweet-smelling oils and perfumed baths of Hollywood imagination. In truth, the medieval brothel was a breeding ground for all manner of infestations, from lice to more serious diseases. The perfumes and potions used were less about allure and more about necessity, masking the smells of unwashed bodies in an era when bathing was considered a luxury rather than a norm. Yet, despite these stark realities, prostitutes held a peculiar place in the social consciousness. They were vilified, and yet vitally necessary, their existence acknowledged in law and tradition. For instance, the Venetian courtesan Veronica Franco became a celebrated poet and intellectual in the 16th century, her life a testament to the complex interplay of respect and reproach that surrounded her profession. But Franco was the exception, not the rule, and her fame was a rare beacon in a sea of anonymity. Moreover, the literature of the time often cast these women in roles that were at odds with their actual lives. Chaucer's characters might have wielded wit and wisdom, but in reality, most prostitutes had little power over their circumstances. Their stories were not of empowerment, but of endurance, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. As we peel back the layers of myth, it becomes clear that the romanticized image of the medieval prostitute is just that, an image, a shadow play that obscures the harsher truths of their existence. The reality was a complex blend of hardship and resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to adapt and endure in the face of adversity. In examining these myths, we're not just debunking tales, we're illuminating the real stories of women who lived and worked in a world that often saw them as little more than shadows. By confronting the romanticized narratives, we honor their true legacy, the resilience and resourcefulness that saw them through the darkest of times. The popular legends of the medieval prostitute might have been spun from threads of fantasy, but their real lives were woven from the fabric of survival. And as we continue this journey, remember that every myth we unravel brings us closer to understanding the truth of their existence, a truth that is as compelling as it is sobering. So, let's keep unraveling, because the medieval world has more stories to tell, and trust me, they're not all fairy tales. So, as we peel back the layers of myth and reality, let's ponder what the medieval past can teach us about our current perceptions of sex work and hygiene. Spoiler alert, it's not just about grimy streets and the occasional whiff of rosemary. Fast forward to the present, where our modern cities boast plumbing that would make a medieval monarch weep with envy. Yet, the stigma surrounding sex work remains as stubbornly sticky as a medieval mud puddle. Despite the centuries, societies still wrestle with the same contradictions. Reliance on sex work as an economic staple while simultaneously condemning it. It's like trying to enjoy a guilty pleasure while pretending it's a salad. Let's face it, the resilience of sex workers throughout history is nothing short of remarkable. Medieval prostitutes were the OG hustlers, navigating a labyrinth of legal restrictions and social scorn with a dexterity that would impress any modern entrepreneur. They were the ultimate survivors, proving that when life gives you medieval lemons, you make lemonade and maybe charge a denier for a sip. And what about hygiene? In an age where hand sanitizer is as essential as oxygen, it's easy to look back and chuckle at medieval cleanliness, or lack thereof. But think about it. They did the best they could with what they had. Today's hygiene standards owe much to the past's trial and error, emphasis on error. Medieval people may not have had the luxury of antibacterial soap, but their resourcefulness laid the groundwork for our obsession with cleanliness. After all, the concept of clean is an ever-evolving beast. Now, let's talk about survival. The tale of medieval prostitutes is a testament to human tenacity. These women operated within a societal framework that was about as supportive as a rickety ladder. Yet, they managed to carve out a niche, providing services that were as in demand then as they are now. Their story echoes through time, reminding us that the human spirit is nothing if not adaptable. But what can modern society learn from this dusty chapter of history? For starters, understanding history could foster a more nuanced view of sex work today. Recognizing the complexities of the medieval past might help to demystify the present, highlighting that sex work has always been intertwined with social, economic, and personal survival strategies. It's a reminder that these issues are not new, and that they are a lot more complicated than a simple moral binary. On the hygiene front, history serves as a cautionary tale. We might take our daily showers for granted, but the medieval struggle with sanitation has an eerie echo in today's ongoing battles with pollution and public health. It's a reminder that progress is not just about shiny new tech, but about learning from the past's less than glamorous moments. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, it's that history is messy, literally and figuratively. The lives of medieval prostitutes weren't just about dirt and desperation. They were about navigating a world that was as full of contradictions as a Shakespearean play. Their stories remind us of the enduring themes of survival and resilience, the human capacity to adapt, and the importance of acknowledging that the past is more than just a collection of quaint anecdotes. It's a complex, tangled web that still influences the present. As we conclude, let's leave the medieval streets behind, but not the lessons they offer. These women who lived on the fringes have much to teach us about resilience, adaptability, and the complexities of human society. They remind us that while history might repeat itself, it's never an exact replica. So, let's embrace the past with all its grit and grime, and use it to illuminate our way forward. After all, what's a little historical dirt between friends? Your eyelids flutter open to the sound of distant chatter in the bustling city of Thebes, circa 1500 BCE. As the early morning sun filters through the reed mat that serves as your window, you've got one thing on your mind: beer. Not the frosty pint from your favorite local brewery, but the ancient Egyptian version, an everyday essential, not just a Friday night indulgence. In this time and place, beer isn't just a beverage, it's survival in a clay jar. You see, water in ancient Egypt wasn't exactly bottled at the source and branded as artesian. The Nile, while majestic and life-giving, was a cocktail of silt and questionable hygiene. So beer, with its fermentation process, was safer to drink than water. It's your morning coffee, your hydration, and your sustenance all rolled into one. And today, you're diving into the nitty-gritty of how it's made. First up, ingredients. Forget hops and yeast packets. We're talking emmer wheat and barley, the OG grains of the brewing world. Emmer wheat, or Triticum dicoccum if you're feeling fancy, is like the hipster cousin of modern wheat, ancient, a bit harder to work with, but oh so worth it for that authentic taste. Barley, on the other hand, is the Robin to Emma's Batman, a trusty sidekick that's been around since at least 8000 BCE. Now, don't imagine modern golden waves of grain swaying in the breeze. Ancient Egyptian fields were more like organized chaos. Harvesting wasn't a John Deere affair. It was sweat, sickles, and serious sunburn. Once you've collected enough emmer and barley, it's time to grind. And by grind, I mean with a stone as your only tool. No electric blenders here, just you, some elbow grease, and a grindstone. Fun fact, this part of the process likely left ancient Egyptians with a bit of extra grit in their teeth. Stone ground meant literally stone ground, as tiny bits of rock often ended up in the flour. Now, why go through all this trouble? Well, beer was more than a drink. It was nutrition in a jar. It packed more sustenance than the bread of the day, which was, let's be honest, more like a brick than a baguette. Beer provided calories, vitamins, and minerals crucial for workers who were spending their days building those impressive pyramids we all ogle at in history books. Move over, kale smoothies. Beer was the original superfood. But let's not romanticize it too much. Sure, you might think of beer as the nectar of the gods, but in reality, it was the fuel of the masses. The notion of beer as a divine drink comes from its role in religious ceremonies and offerings to gods like Osiris. Yet, for the average Theban, it was less about spiritual transcendence and more about keeping hunger at bay and avoiding the, shall we say, Nile tummy troubles. So, as you roll up your metaphorical sleeves and get ready to brew, keep in mind that you're not just making a drink, you're crafting a staple of ancient life. The process is labor-intensive, a bit gritty, and far from glamorous, but it's also the cornerstone of survival. And as you start this day in Thebes, you'll find that the real magic of ancient Egyptian beer isn't in divine myths, but in its everyday necessity. Now that you've got your grains ground and ready, the real magic, or chemistry, for those less poetically inclined, begins. Welcome to the mashing stage, where the line between baker and brewer starts to blur. You're essentially making bread, but not the kind you'd slap some avocado on. This is bread's boozy alter ego. Take your emmer wheat and barley flour, add a splash of water, and mix it into a dough. Then you bake it until it's just hard enough to be a bread loaf and just soft enough to still be mashable. It's a delicate balance, a culinary tightrope walk without the safety net of modern ovens or thermometers. Once you have your loaves, it's time to get messy. Break them up and soak them in water to create a grainy mush. This swampy mixture might not win any culinary awards, but it's pure gold to an ancient Egyptian. Here's where the real science kicks in. The starches in the grains begin to break down into sugars, thanks to the enzymes present. Sounds fancy, but really, it's nature doing its thing. Give it a good stir and let it sit, and voila, you're on your way to making beer. Now, let's talk about fermentation, an enchanting process that turns sugar into alcohol, much like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, except the hat is a clay pot, and the rabbit is your thirst-quenching beer. Ancient Egyptians didn't have lab-engineered yeast packets. They relied on the yeast floating around in the air. It's like open-air jazz, where the yeast improvises a bit. If you've got sourdough starter experience, you'll know the drill. These wild yeasts, along with bacteria, feast on the sugars and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. The clay pots used for fermentation were ideal because their porous nature allowed these wild yeasts to flourish. Now, before you get too starry-eyed thinking about artisanal clay pot brewing, remember, the process was anything but predictable. Sometimes, you'd end up with a delightful brew. Other times, you'd get something more akin to vinegar. And because there were no thermometers or timers, you had to rely on instinct, experience, and perhaps a little divine intervention. It was a bit like playing beer roulette with the gods. This is where the women come in. Yes, women were the brewers in ancient Egypt, and they didn't just dabble in this craft, they dominated it. Brewing was considered an extension of domestic duties, much like baking bread. But this wasn't just about keeping the household well lubricated. It was a respected and essential skill. Women were the original brewmasters, managing the intricate balance of ingredients and timing, which were crucial for a successful batch. Picture this. Women gathered around the hearth, clay pots bubbling away, sharing techniques and recipes passed down through generations. It was both a domestic and community affair, and the knowledge was as cherished and guarded as any family secret. And let's not forget, this was a time when beer was as much a currency as it was a drink. Workers on Pharaoh's grand construction projects were often paid in beer, about 4 to 5 liters a day. So, in a sense, these women held the very economy in their hands, brewing the liquid wages that kept the workforce moving. Speaking of currency, beer wasn't just about getting the job done. It was woven into the very fabric of ancient Egyptian society. It held religious significance too. Picture a priest pouring a libation of beer to Osiris, the god of the afterlife, in hopes of garnering some divine favor. Beer was believed to have protective qualities, used in rituals to safeguard both the living and the dead. But let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't a utopia of spiritual enlightenment and community brewing. The practicalities of managing the fermentation process without modern tech were daunting. The quality and safety of the brew were always a gamble, and while beer was a staple, it was also a necessity born out of less than ideal circumstances. The Nile's unreliable quality made beer, with its bacteria-killing alcohol content, the safer bet. Plus, those who brewed beer wielded significant social power, and as with any power, it could be a double-edged sword. The ability to produce beer could elevate one's social standing, but it also meant bearing the weight of expectation to supply a critical community resource. So, as you stand in the bustling city of Thebes, with clay pots bubbling and the scent of fermenting grain in the air, remember that you're not just witnessing a brewing process, you're experiencing a cornerstone of ancient Egyptian life. It's a world where women held the keys to both sustenance and social structure, where beer was a liquid currency, and every batch brewed was a roll of the cosmic dice. As you ponder this, keep in mind that while the romantic image of ancient beer may allure us, the reality was gritty and complex, much like the people who brewed it. And as with any good story, there's more to come. Stay tuned as we explore further into this intoxicating history. As the midday sun bakes the streets of Thebes, let's dive into the economics of ancient Egyptian beer, where a clay jar of brew was as good as gold, or at least a handful of fish. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, beer wasn't just a drink. It was currency, sustenance, and social glue all rolled into one. First off, let's talk barter. Imagine you're a laborer, sweating under the relentless Egyptian sun, dreaming of a cool breeze and a hearty meal. But forget about coins jingling in your pockets. You're trading in liquid assets. A jar of beer could snag you a couple of fish, a loaf of bread, or even a day's labor from a fellow worker. It's like the ancient version of Venmo, minus the app and the smartphone. Beer was the oil that kept the economic cogs of Egypt turning, and everyone was in on the transaction. But beer wasn't just a casual trade commodity. It was woven into the very fabric of labor wages, especially for those monumental pyramid projects. Picture this: thousands of workers, toiling away, moving colossal stones with nothing but muscle and ingenuity. Their reward, around 4 to 5 liters of beer a day. Beer was their pay, their hydration, and their morale booster, a liquid lifeline. And before you get too misty-eyed thinking about labor rights, remember, this wasn't exactly a choice. Beer was as vital as food, and with the Nile's less-than-stellar water quality, it was the safer option by far. Now, who was keeping tabs on all this liquid currency? Enter the pharaohs and priests, the ancient equivalent of quality control officers. These guys weren't just sitting on thrones. They were the gatekeepers of grain supplies and beer production. Pharaohs needed a steady flow of beer, not only to keep their workforce from revolting, but also to maintain their divine image. After all, a happy worker is a productive worker, and productive workers built legacies that would last millennia. Priests, on the other hand, had their own reasons for ensuring high-quality beer, with religious ceremonies often involving beer offerings, like appeasing Osiris, god of the afterlife. The brew had to be up to divine standards, and let's face it, no one wants to face the wrath of an unhappy deity, or an unhappy priest for that matter. But here's where the plot thickens: droughts. The fickle nature of Mother Earth. When the Nile decided to throw a dry spell, grain supplies dwindled, and beer production took a hit. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a full-blown crisis. Imagine an entire society suddenly short on its liquid currency. The impact rippled through every stratum of Egyptian life, from the grandest temples to the humblest homes. In these lean times, beer became a precious commodity. The pharaohs, with their fingers on the pulse of their kingdom's resources, had to make tough calls. Do you cut the workers' beer rations and risk a revolt, or do you dip into the grain reserves meant for bread? It was a delicate balancing act, a high-stakes game of resource management that could make or break a reign. And while we're myth-busting, let's dispel the notion that these ancient leaders were benevolent beer barons. They weren't doling out pints out of the goodness of their hearts. It was a calculated move to keep the workforce fueled and the economy stable. Pharaohs and priests wielded grain and beer like power tools, shaping society and ensuring their own status remained unchallenged. So, as you sip on your imaginary ancient Egyptian brew, remember that each drop was a part of a vast and complex economic system, one that intertwined the sacred and the mundane, the powerful and the everyday worker. It's a world where beer was more than just a drink. It was a cornerstone of civilization, a reflection of both the abundance and fragility of human endeavor. And as we leave this dusty marketplace of ancient Thebes, there's still more to uncover in this intoxicating tale of history's original brewmasters. Stay tuned, because the story of beer in ancient Egypt is far from over. Now, as the sun dips below the horizon in Thebes, let's talk about what happens when the day's hard work is done, and it's time to unwind with a jug of beer. You're thinking, ancient taverns must have been a peaceful little getaway. Well, hold onto your papyrus, because ancient Egyptian social scenes were anything but tranquil. Picture an evening in one of these bustling taverns, known as Perret in the local lingo, where clay lamps flicker and cast shadows on the mud brick walls. These weren't your quiet, intimate pubs with soft jazz playing in the background. Nope, taverns in ancient Egypt were lively hubs of social interaction, where the brew flowed as freely as the gossip. Here, people from all walks of life gathered, not just laborers and farmers, but traders, soldiers, and even scribes. Everyone was there to quench their thirst and share tales of the day, blending the sacred and the profane into a heady mix of camaraderie and chaos. But let's not romanticize this too much. While beer was indeed a social lubricant, it was also the root of considerable societal headaches. You see, the Egyptians loved their beer, but moderation wasn't exactly their strong suit. Public drunkenness was more common than a Nile flood, and taverns were often the epicenter of rowdiness. Picture a scene out of a college frat party, minus the red solo cups, and with a lot more linen. It's no wonder that ancient Egyptian literature and art often depicted people under the influence with a mix of humor and disapproval. Take, for instance, the Instructions of Annie, a papyrus scroll offering sage advice. Do not get drunk in a tavern. You will stagger and fall, and your words will be turned into slander. Talk about a public service announcement. The Egyptians were acutely aware of the social pitfalls of overindulgence, and they weren't shy about calling it out. Artists painted scenes of inebriated revelers, stumbling and making fools of themselves as a cautionary tale. But despite the warnings, the allure of the alehouse remained irresistible. Now, you might ask, was it just the fun-loving Egyptians who let loose, or did beer play a role in more serious societal issues? Glad you asked. The dark side of beer was indeed a hot topic. Public health was a concern, even in ancient Egypt, and frequent intoxication didn't do anyone any favors. Chronic heavy drinking was linked to various health problems, from liver issues to malnutrition. And let's not forget the ripple effect of drunken behavior, domestic disputes, street brawls, and the occasional regrettable tattoo choices. Okay, maybe not tattoos, but you get the idea. Interestingly, the Egyptians were nothing if not resourceful when it came to managing their beer habits. They invented hangover cures long before Bloody Marys and aspirin. One popular remedy involved wearing a necklace made of the leaves of the castor oil plant, perhaps the ancient equivalent of a greasy breakfast, and a strong cup of coffee. There was a sense of humor in how they approached their vices, a blend of acknowledgement and acceptance that speaks volumes about their culture. In the realm of literature, beer also found its way into the tales of gods and mortals. Take the story of Hathor, the goddess who, when sent by Ra to punish humanity, was pacified with red beer. The brew was colored to resemble blood, and after drinking it, Hathor fell into a deep sleep, sparing humanity from her wrath. This tale underscores the dual nature of beer in Egyptian society as both a gift and a potential threat. As the night deepens and the tavern grows louder, the social dynamics become more pronounced. Relationships are forged and broken over jugs of beer. Deals are struck, songs are sung, and tales of heroism or exaggerations thereof are shared. The tavern was a microcosm of Egyptian society, reflecting both its strengths and weaknesses. It was a place where hierarchies blurred, at least for a few hours, and where the commonality of humanity shone through the haze of inebriation. But don't be fooled into thinking every drinking session was a democratic utopia. Social status still played a role, and the quality of beer one could afford often mirrored one's place in the societal pecking order. The elite had access to the finest brews, often flavored with exotic ingredients, while the average worker made do with the more basic, sometimes inconsistent, batches. And while we're at it, let's dispel the myth that every ancient Egyptian was a happy-go-lucky beer enthusiast. There were teetotalers, too, who frowned upon the boisterous tavern culture. Some religious sects advocated for moderation or abstinence, viewing overindulgence as a moral failing. This tension between indulgence and restraint played out in art and literature, a constant reminder of the societal tightrope the Egyptians walked. So, as you sit in this imaginary tavern, sipping your clay cup of beer and watching the antics unfold, remember that you're not just observing a drinking culture. You're witnessing a reflection of ancient Egyptian society in all its complexity. Beer was both a social glue and a societal challenge, a symbol of both unity and excess. It's a reminder that while times change, human nature remains remarkably consistent. As we peer into the flickering lamplight of the past, the tale of ancient Egyptian beer continues to unfold, as rich and nuanced as the brew itself. Stay tuned, because there's more to discover in this captivating saga. As you take in the fading light of Thebes, it's time to reflect on the lasting impact of ancient Egyptian brewing. Now, you might be tempted to see these ancient brewers as merely primitive folks with a penchant for a good drink. But let's not underestimate our ancient friends. They were pioneers in fermentation, the ancient chemists who laid down the groundwork for future civilizations' brewing endeavors. Their methods, although rudimentary, were quite ingenious, and their understanding of fermentation was surprisingly sophisticated. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. The Egyptians had a knack for turning basic ingredients into liquid gold, and they did this without the benefit of modern science. They harnessed natural fermentation processes with an intuitive grasp that would make any modern craft brewer nod in appreciation. For starters, the use of clay parts for fermentation wasn't just a happy accident. These parts' porous surfaces encouraged the growth of wild yeasts, a kind of natural starter culture. It's like they were conducting a symphony with yeast as the star performer, even if they couldn't see the sheet music. This wasn't just about getting a buzz. It was about survival and innovation. The Egyptians' ability to produce a safe, drinkable beverage from potentially lethal water was a lifesaver, quite literally. And let's not forget, this wasn't a society churning out beer for fun and games. They were constructing architectural marvels like the pyramids, and beer was the fuel that kept the workforce moving. This was a civilization that understood the economics of life-sustaining liquids and leveraged it to build some of humanity's most enduring legacies. If you think about it, the technological advancements that sprang from Egyptian brewing were no small potatoes. Their techniques spread throughout the ancient world, influencing the brewing methods of other cultures. From the Sumerians to the Greeks, everyone took a page out of the Egyptians' brewing handbook, with the ancient world's version of trendsetters, proving that good ideas, much like a good brew, are worth sharing. And speaking of sharing, let's debunk the notion that these ancient drinkers were just a bunch of boozy revelers. Sure, they loved a good time, but their relationship with beer was more nuanced. They recognized its potential, not only as a beverage, but as a tool for social and economic cohesion. Beer was a staple that united people across social strata, from the pharaoh's court to the humblest farmer's field. It was both a social lubricant and a currency, a testament to its multifaceted role in their society. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the regulation of beer, a topic that remains as relevant today as it was back then. Even in ancient Egypt, they had rules about who could brew and how. The pharaohs and priests kept a tight leash on grain supplies, ensuring the quality and availability of beer met both divine and mortal standards. It was a delicate balance of supply and demand, with a dash of divine oversight to keep everyone on their toes. There's something almost comforting in knowing that some things never change. Beer, whether in a clay pot or a modern pint glass, is subject to regulations, taxes, and quality checks. It's a universal truth that spans millennia. People will always love their beer, and someone will always be there to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. So, as you wrap up your day in Thebes, take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those ancient brewers. They weren't just making beer, they were crafting a cornerstone of civilization. From technological innovations to social rituals, their impact resonates through history. And while the Nile may not flood as predictably as it once did, the ripples of their brewing expertise continue to influence us today. In the end, ancient Egyptian brewing is a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. It's a reminder that while the tools and ingredients may change, the fundamental desire to gather, celebrate, and enjoy a simple drink remains the same. So, here's to the ancient Egyptians, the original brewmasters, whose legacy is as enduring as the pyramids themselves. As you step back into your world, maybe with a cold one in hand, Remember that every sip connects you to a tradition that's as old as civilization itself. Cheers to that. The sun's barely peeking over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the Nile, and there you are, standing on the ancient Egyptian version of a rush-hour freeway. You're not in a chariot, though, no horses or wheels in sight. Instead, you're on a bustling river, surrounded by a flotilla of boats that make the Hudson River look like a quiet pond. Yes, my friend, this is your daily commute in ancient Egypt, where the Nile is your road and the wind your engine. Let's start with your ride. Your boat could be a simple papyrus canoe, which is basically the ancient equivalent of a bike. Not much space, just you, a few goods, and maybe a friend who owes you a favor. But if you're lucky, or wealthy, you might be aboard a grand merchant ship, a floating marketplace teeming with cargo. These ships were the 18-wheelers of their day, hauling everything from grain to exotic goods like incense and ebony, essential for keeping Egypt's economy afloat. And let's not forget the stats. It's estimated that about 90% of Egypt's population lived within spitting distance of the Nile. That's nearly everyone and their crocodile, which made this river a highway for commerce, culture, and yes, gossip. Imagine every single stoplight in your town being replaced by bustling harbors where merchants and traders bark their wares in a cacophony that would make Times Square seem serene. Now, here's a curveball for you. The variety of boats. You've got your papyrus skiffs, light, flexible and perfect for short trips or narrow canals. Then there are the wooden ships, which required a bit more engineering finesse. By the time of the New Kingdom, these ships were sophisticated enough to rival any Mediterranean vessel, and they didn't even have the benefit of modern tech. Instead, they relied on sheer human ingenuity and occasionally divine intervention. Yes, some captains swore by a little prayer to Khnum, god of the Nile, just in case. But let's not romanticize too much. While the notion of drifting down the Nile sounds idyllic, this was no pleasure cruise. The river could be a moody mistress. Floods were unpredictable, and navigating a boat laden with heavy goods required skill and muscle. Think of it as ancient cross fit. Plus, there was always the risk of bandits, because where there's trade, there's someone trying to make a quick buck off it. Pirates of the Nile, if you will. Here's a nugget for your morning coffee. During peak trading seasons, the Nile was so packed it could rival any modern highway in its busyness. And with that busyness came its own set of problems. Traffic jams, collisions, and delays. Sound familiar? It's like the ancient Egyptians invented the traffic report millennia before radio was even a twinkle in someone's eye. But why did this matter so much? Well, the Nile wasn't just a river. It was the backbone of Egyptian civilization. Without it, the grand pyramids might never have been built, and the pharaohs would have been just guys in fancy hats. The river allowed for the transport of massive stones and materials from quarries far south, making monumental architecture possible. And it wasn't just about the big projects. The Nile facilitated the day-to-day trading of food, clothing, and pottery, keeping the wheels of daily life turning. Oh, and speaking of turning, let's nod to the wind. The prevailing northerly winds meant that traveling upstream required some clever sailwork. You see, it wasn't just about drifting lazily downriver. Navigating upstream against the current was the real test of a sailor's mettle. Imagine the satisfaction, or relief, when you finally docked at your destination, ready to barter or unload your cargo. Now, let's address a classic myth, that the ancient Egyptians were isolationists, disconnected from the rest of the ancient world. Not quite. Thanks to the Nile, Egypt was more like the buzzing hub in a network of trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. The river was a conduit not just for goods, but also for ideas, technologies, and cultures. Trade brought in not only the exotic spices and luxury goods that the elite craved, but also the knowledge and innovations that helped Egypt thrive for millennia. So, as you stand on the deck of your vessel, inhaling the fresh morning air mixed with the not-so-fresh scent of fish, consider this. You're part of a vast, almost mythical system that's as intricate as any modern economy. The Nile is your lifeline, your workplace, and your home, all rolled into one. And with every stroke of the oar or shift of the sail, you're contributing to the grand tapestry of one of history's most enduring civilizations. By the end of the day, as the sun dips below the horizon, you'll have navigated not just a river, but the very currents of history itself. But let's pause your river journey for just a second to take a closer look at what's actually floating past you on those boats. Ancient Egypt's economy was like a well-oiled machine, and the Nile was the conveyor belt gliding it all along. We're talking grain, the staple of the Egyptian diet, and the backbone of their economy. Picture 500,000 tons of grain annually, enough to make even the hungriest of hippos jealous. This wasn't just for feeding the masses either. It was currency and collateral. Grain was stored in massive granaries, the ancient world's version of a bank vault, and was taxed to the hilt. In fact, if you were an Egyptian farmer, you had to fork over about a fifth of your harvest to the state. And yes, that's a lot of bread, even for today's carb lovers. And it wasn't just about feeding people. The surplus grain was traded for other essentials and luxuries. Picture this: Egyptian grain making its way to the Levant, and in return, timber and wine flowing back up the Nile. This was the sophisticated swap meet of ancient times, and Egypt was the star trader. But it wasn't all just barter and hope. The Egyptians had a system of standardized weights and measures, because let's face it, approximately isn't going to cut it when you're trading your hard-earned harvest. They used a unit called the deben, a weight of about 91 grams, which was the gold standard, quite literally, since it was used to measure everything from copper to cloth. Speaking of gold, Egypt was practically dripping with the stuff, and the Nile was the golden artery through which it flowed. The deserts east of the river were rich with mines, and the gold extracted was traded far and wide. This wasn't just any old bling. It was the bling that could get you a seat at the big boys' table in the ancient world. Gold from Egypt was so important that it even greased the wheels of diplomacy. Pharaohs would send lavish gold gifts to neighboring kings, a sort of ancient, hey, let's be friends gesture, or perhaps more accurately, look at how rich I am, be impressed. But before you think the Egyptians were just rolling in dough or gold, they had a few logistical hurdles to navigate. And to the scribes, the unsung heroes of the Nile's bureaucratic ballet. Armed with papyrus and ink, these guys were the human spreadsheets of ancient Egypt. Every transaction, every tax, every shipment was meticulously recorded. Imagine the stacks of papyrus they went through. It's like ancient Egypt was an early adopter of the paper trail, long before email chains and digital receipts cluttered our lives. Taxes, though, were the real kicker. In a society where the state controlled almost everything, paying up was non-negotiable. Imagine forking over your taxes not just in grain, but in labor. Yes, you heard that right, labor. Didn't pay your dues. Well, the state could draft you to work on public projects, like building those fancy pyramids or maintaining the irrigation canals. So, while the grandeur of the pyramids is awe-inspiring, it's worth remembering that they were also a testament to an intricate web of taxes and labor obligations. Now, let's debunk a romantic notion while we're at it. The idea that all this was done with smiles and sunshine. The truth was grittier. The Nile might have been the lifeblood of Egypt, but it was also the source of power struggles and economic disparity. The elites who controlled the flow of goods and gold wielded immense power. The average laborer, meanwhile, was more likely to be working the fields or rowing a boat laden with goods than feasting on exotic delicacies. And let's not forget the role of imports in this whole shebang. It wasn't just a one-way street of Egyptian generosity. The river brought in luxury items that made life at the top a little more comfortable. Incense from Punt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and cedar from Lebanon were just a few of the treasures that trickled in. These items weren't just pretty trinkets, they were status symbols, and in the rigid hierarchy of ancient Egypt, status was everything. But it wasn't all about the high life. The Nile was the great equalizer, providing sustenance and a means of livelihood for countless Egyptians. It was the thread that wove together a society that was both deeply stratified and interdependent. The river was a shared resource, its waters feeding the fields that fed the people. Even in the face of droughts and floods, it was a constant reminder of nature's dual capacity to give and take away. As you drift along the Nile, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of trade and transport, you're witnessing an economic marvel. It's a system that's as complex as any modern economy, driven by human ingenuity and the relentless flow of the river. The goods that traveled these waters were more than just items of trade. They were the building blocks of a civilization that would endure for millennia. And so, as you contemplate this intricate dance of goods and gold, remember that the Nile was more than just a river. It was a lifeline, a highway, and a marketplace. It was the pulse of ancient Egypt. a testament to what humans can achieve when they harness the resources at their disposal. And with every gust of wind and stroke of the oar, the river continues to tell its story, one that's as rich and varied as the land it nurtured. As your boat drifts along Egypt's liquid lifeline, you might be lulled into thinking this is the world's most scenic commute. But hold that thought, because once you delve into the social dynamics aboard these trading vessels, you'll see it's less about leisure and more about survival. These boats weren't just floating warehouses. They were microcosms of Egyptian society, complete with hierarchies, rivalries, and enough drama to rival a modern-day reality show. First off, let's talk crew. Leading the charge was the captain, or Reedy, if you want to sound authentic, an individual who wasn't just steering the ship, but was also the CEO, CFO, and HR manager rolled into one. This was a job requiring not only navigational skills, but also a solid grasp of diplomacy and economics. A successful trader needed to negotiate deals, manage a crew, and maybe even sweet-talk a few local officials to avoid unnecessary tolls, aka bribes. Underneath the captain's command were the oarsmen and sailors. Don't let the idyllic vision of rowing under the sun fool you. This was back-breaking work. Rowing against the Nile's current was akin to a full-body workout that would make your CrossFit instructor proud. Yet these guys did it day in and day out, their muscles sculpted by the Nile itself. Talk about ancient gains. And then there were the merchants. Picture them as the wheeler-dealers of the ancient world, their wealth and reputation riding on the success of each voyage. They had to balance the delicate act of haggling for the best prices while ensuring their goods arrived safely. Think of it like playing an intense game of Monopoly, but with real assets and no chance cards. These trading vessels were also home to scribes, the unsung heroes documenting every transaction. Their papyrus scrolls were the ancient equivalent of spreadsheets, capturing the minutiae of trade with meticulous detail. Lose a scroll, and you might as well kiss your profits goodbye. Imagine the pressure of keeping those records accurate when a single slip of the reed pen could mean financial ruin. But let's shatter a myth or two. The idea of sailing leisurely down the Nile, sipping on fermented date wine while a gentle breeze ruffles your kilt. Not quite the reality. The Nile was notorious for its unpredictability. One minute you're gliding smoothly, the next you're battling sudden gusts or dodging sandbanks that would put a modern obstacle course to shame. Throw in the occasional crocodile, because yes, Nile crocs were a thing, and it's clear this was no pleasure cruise. Speaking of crocs, let's not forget the human predators. The river was rife with bandits looking to make a quick buck, or debon, off unsuspecting traders. These river pirates were the bane of merchants, their attacks as swift as they were ruthless. Picture a high-seas heist, but on the Nile's muddy waters. If you were a trader, you had to be as savvy in self-defense as you were in commerce. Now, why was all this worth it? Because the Nile was the economic backbone of Egypt, and those who mastered its currents could tap into its vast wealth. The river connected bustling urban centers with remote villages, facilitating a network of trade that spanned thousands of miles. It was a system that required not just brute strength, but also strategic alliances and a keen sense of timing. Miss the seasonal floods, and you might as well have thrown your cargo overboard. And let's talk about the cargo. It wasn't just grain and gold making their way down the river. The boats were packed with everything from papyrus scrolls to pottery, oil, and linen. Diversity of goods reflected the richness of Egyptian society and its connections with the world beyond its borders. Each item had a story, a journey that began in the hands of farmers, artisans, and miners, ending in the bustling markets of Thebes or Memphis. But here's the kicker. Despite the wealth flowing down the Nile, life aboard these boats was tough. Long hours, cramped quarters, and the constant threat of danger made this a grueling gig. Yet for many, it was a way of life, passed down through generations like a family heirloom. It was a testament to human resilience and the relentless drive to carve out a living from the river's bounty. The Nile, in all its complexity, was more than just a river. It was a bustling corridor of commerce, a stage for social interplay, and a testament to the ingenuity of ancient traders who dared to chart its waters. While the romance of a Nile journey is undeniable, the reality was a gritty testament to human perseverance. The river was a fickle mistress, offering riches and ruin in equal measure. As you stand on the deck, Consider the myriad stories that have unfolded along its banks, stories of triumph and tragedy, all woven into the fabric of one of history's most enduring civilizations. And so, as the sun sets on another day of trade, you're left with a deeper appreciation for the river that fueled Egypt's rise. The Nile wasn't just a backdrop for ancient life. It was the very stage upon which the drama of Egyptian society played out. It was both a cradle of civilization and a crucible of human endeavor, shaping the destiny of all who dared to navigate its waters. As night falls, the river's currents continue their timeless journey, carrying with them the echoes of a world long past, yet ever present in the legacy of those who once called it home. Just as night cloaks the Nile in mystery, the afternoon sun reveals secrets of power and politics that lie beneath the river's surface. You see, while the Nile's currents carried Egypt's wealth, its political tides could turn a trader's fortunes faster than you can say Tutankhamun. This wasn't just a matter of navigating waters. It was about understanding who controlled them and why. Let's dive right into the political soup. Imagine the pharaohs not just as rulers in fancy headgear, but as the original traffic controllers of the ancient world. They commanded key trade routes, wielding power over what floated where and when. The pharaoh wasn't just a figurehead. He was the linchpin in a vast bureaucratic machine. Running an empire wasn't all pyramids and parties. It was about strategizing trade, securing borders, and occasionally dealing with neighbors who didn't quite understand the concept of personal space. Speaking of neighbors, let's talk Nubians and Assyrians. These weren't just folks with whom the Egyptians shared a love for eyeliner. They were major players in the geopolitical game. The Nubians, for instance, were both trading partners and rivals. Their control over gold mines made them indispensable, and a bit of a thorn in the pharaoh's side. Imagine trying to negotiate a trade deal while simultaneously keeping an eye on your gold reserves. It was like playing chess on a board where the pieces occasionally tried to rebel. Now, the Assyrians, those guys were the original disruptors. Their empire stretched across Mesopotamia, and their influence trickled down into Egypt like a particularly persistent sandstorm. They didn't just want a piece of the trade pie. They wanted the whole bakery. And while pharaohs like Ramses Roman II were busy adding new wings to their temples, the Assyrians were dreaming of adding Egypt to their empire. Talk about ambitious. But back to the river. While the political landscape was as complex as a hieroglyphic crossword, the Nile was the stage where these dramas unfolded. Traders had to navigate not only the river's physical obstacles, but also the political currents. One wrong move, and you might find your goods seized by a local governor who decided a toll was in order, or worse, a foreign power laying claim to your cargo. Imagine planning your trade route like a modern-day CEO planning market expansion, only with more crocodiles and fewer PowerPoint presentations. And let's not forget the legal codes that kept this bustling trade afloat. While the pharaohs were the ultimate authority, they couldn't be everywhere at once. So, they relied on a network of officials and scribes to enforce the rules. These weren't just any rules. They were detailed and precise, aiming to maintain order amidst the chaos. Picture this: a set of laws that covered everything from the weight of your grain shipment to the distance between docking points. It was like having the IRS, the Department of Transportation, and a maritime inspector all rolled into one. Let's bust a myth while we're at it. The notion that ancient Egypt was a land of lawless anarchy, where might made right. In reality, the Egyptian legal system was surprisingly sophisticated. Judges were appointed to settle disputes, and legal scribes kept detailed records, ensuring that the scales of justice were as balanced as possible. So, while you might think of the Nile as a free-for-all highway, it was more akin to a well-regulated autobahn, with rules to keep everyone from crashing into one another. Now, why did all this political maneuvering matter? Because in ancient Egypt, trade wasn't just about making a profit, it was about survival. Control the trade routes, and you controlled the flow of essential goods. Lose that control, and you might find yourself at the mercy of a rival power, or worse, your own citizens, who weren't known for their patience when it came to bread shortages. And speaking of bread, let's talk economics. The Nile was the lifeline that allowed Egypt to build one of the most prosperous civilizations of the ancient world. But prosperity came with a price. The need to constantly engage in political chess games to secure resources and alliances. A pharaoh who couldn't maintain this delicate balance risked losing not just his throne, but his head. literally. In a world where divine rule was the norm, failing to keep the guards and your subjects happy was a one-way ticket to the underworld. Now, we can't forget the human element in this grand political theater. The average trader navigating the Nile wasn't just a pawn in the pharaoh's game. They were active participants, each with their own ambitions and fears. These traders were the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, their boats carrying not just goods, but also the hopes and dreams of a civilization. Yet, for all their importance, they were also at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Imagine trying to run a business today while dealing with fluctuating political alliances, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of invasion. It's enough to make any modern entrepreneur break into a cold sweat. Yet, for ancient traders, this was just another day on the job. Their resilience and adaptability were nothing short of remarkable, as they navigated not just the river, but the ever-changing tides of politics. So, as the afternoon sun blazes down on the Nile, casting long shadows over boats laden with goods, remember that what you're witnessing is more than just trade. It's a complex dance of power and politics, where every transaction is a step in a larger game, and every trader is a player in a story that spans millennia. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a stage, a battleground, and a marketplace, all rolled into one. And in its waters, the fate of empires was decided, one boatload of goods at a time. As we leave the river's bustling surface, keep in mind that this political landscape is just one layer of the story. With every rise and fall of the Nile's waters, history was made, and the story of ancient Egypt continues to unfold, one ripple at a time. The stage is set, but the play is far from over. Tune in next time as we delve deeper into the lives of those who called this river home, and uncover the secrets that still lie beneath its surface. As we peel back the layers of history along the Nile, it's time to dive into its cultural and symbolic significance. A river so woven into the Egyptian identity, it might as well have been a member of the family. Now, before you get swept away by visions of mystical lotus flowers and serene sunsets, let's address a few myths that have floated downstream over the centuries. First, the notion of the Nile as a mystical entity. Sure, the Egyptians revered the river, but this wasn't just romantic moonlight and magical incantations. The Nile was worshipped for practical reasons. It was their life insurance policy against famine. The annual inundation deposited nutrient-rich silt, transforming the desert into a breadbasket capable of feeding a burgeoning civilization. Sounds less like magic and more like a solid agricultural plan, right? But don't let the practicality fool you. There was plenty of room for spirituality. The Nile was considered a divine gift from the gods, particularly Hapi, the deity of the inundation. Egyptians held elaborate ceremonies to thank and appease Hapi, hoping for just the right amount of water. Too little, and you've got a drought. Too much. It's time to break out the ancient equivalent of flood insurance. This balancing act was a reminder that even the gods had a sense of humor, or a twisted sense of irony, depending on your perspective. Now, consider how the Nile shaped Egyptian spirituality. The river wasn't just a source of sustenance. It was a cosmic highway connecting the earthly realm with the divine. Its east-to-west flow mirrored the sun's daily journey, a celestial path that also guided the souls of the deceased. In a way, every journey on the Nile was a mini reenactment of the sun god Ra's voyage across the sky, reminding Egyptians of their place in the universe. And if that sounds a bit grandiose, remember that for the Egyptians, life and the afterlife were intricately linked, with the river as the ultimate connector. But let's debunk the idea that everyone was living a life of spiritual enlightenment as they floated down the Nile. While the pharaohs and priests might have been pondering the mysteries of the cosmos, the average trader was more concerned with the mysteries of turning a profit. Spirituality was a luxury for those who didn't have to worry about the next meal or the next shipment. For the common folk, the Nile was less a river of dreams and more a river of hard labor. Yet, this is where the beauty of Egyptian society lies. Despite the harsh realities, the Nile did foster a sense of interconnectedness that transcended class and status. Festivals held along its banks were moments of communal joy, where rich and poor alike could come together to celebrate the river's bounty. These gatherings were a testament to the river's role as a social glue, binding a diverse population in a shared identity. And speaking of identity, let's talk about how this ancient trade network laid the groundwork for Egypt's enduring legacy. The Nile wasn't just a local treasure. It was a vital artery that connected Egypt to the wider world. The goods traded along its length, from grain to gold to papyrus, helped establish Egypt as a powerhouse in the ancient economy. This wasn't a static society clinging to tradition. It was a dynamic civilization constantly evolving through interaction with its neighbors. The influence of Egyptian trade practices rippled across the ancient world, setting standards in everything from shipbuilding to record-keeping. The Egyptians were pioneers in developing a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage trade, a legacy that echoes in modern economic systems. The concept of standardized weights and measures, for instance, is a direct descendant of the Egyptians' meticulous approach to commerce. They understood that precision was power, and their methodical record-keeping ensured that the wheels of trade kept turning smoothly. And let's not forget the global connections fostered by this trade network. While the Nile was the heart of Egyptian society, the veins stretched far beyond its banks. Egyptian traders were the original globetrotters, bringing back not just goods, but also ideas and innovations. The exchange of knowledge, from metallurgy to medicine, was as valuable as any physical trade, fueling advancements that shaped the ancient world and beyond. So, as you reflect on this grand tapestry of trade and culture, consider the legacy of those who navigated the Nile's waters. They were the unsung heroes of an ancient economy, their efforts laying the foundation for a civilization that would stand the test of time. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the lifeblood of a society whose influence still ripples through history. In the end, the Nile's story is one of resilience and ingenuity, of a people who learn to harness the river's power and turn it into prosperity. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, human creativity knows no bounds. As the sun sets on this journey, leaving the Nile shrouded in shadow, its legacy remains, a testament to the enduring spirit of ancient Egypt, etched in the sands of time and the flowing waters of history.